For much of history, the story of Africa's kingdoms has been told in fragments, sometimes through foreign eyes, often through the lens of outside empires. Yet across thousands of years, powerful African states rose, thrived, and sometimes fell, leaving legacies of art, governance, trade, and scholarship that shaped not only the continent, but the wider world. How did these kingdoms form in such varied landscapes? From the green banks of the Nile to the open savannas of the Sahel, the bustling ports of the Indian Ocean coast, and the fortified stone cities of the southern highlands. What forces allowed them to flourish, and what challenges brought them to crisis? This is not a single story, but a connected history stretching from the earliest agricultural communities in the Sahara's wetter age, through the reigns of pharaohs and emperors, to the courtly cities of the medieval Sahel and the maritime networks of the Swahili coast. It is a story of innovation in governance, mastery of trade, adaptation to climate, and negotiation with shifting religious and political currents. Over the course of this journey, we will trace how African rulers forged alliances, commanded armies, and maintained complex economies, while also confronting moments of upheaval from internal rivalries to the arrival of new technologies and foreign powers. By following these kingdoms in chronological order, we can see not only the unique character of each, but also the threads of continuity that link them together. From the first experiments in kingship to the survival of royal traditions in the modern era, this is the full, detailed story of Africa's kingdoms, told through their own historical arc, in their own place in the world. At the close of the last ice age, the African continent looked very different from what we see today. The Sahara, now the largest hot desert in the world, was then a land of lakes, rivers, and grasslands. Seasonal rains nourished tall grasses, and herds of antelope, giraffe, and even hippos grazed in what is now bare sand. Archaeologists call this period the African humid phase, and it began roughly 10,000 years before the Common Era. In this fertile environment, human communities thrived as hunters, fishers, and gatherers, moving with the rhythms of the land. As the millennia passed, these communities began to experiment with new ways of life. They domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats, and cultivated plants in small gardens. Pottery fragments found in the central Sahara and along the Nile Valley show that by about 9,000 years before the Common Era, people were using clay vessels to store grain and water. This was a quiet revolution. Storing food meant that groups could settle for longer in one place, building semi-permanent villages and expanding their social networks. The climate, however, was not fixed. By around 5,000 years before the Common Era, the Great Green Sahara was beginning to dry. The monsoon rains retreated southward, and the lush grasslands slowly turned into the desert we know today. This environmental change had profound consequences. Communities that had once roamed the open savannas were forced to move toward more reliable sources of water, river valleys, lake shores, and coastal regions. Many migrated east toward the Nile, while others settled along the Sahel, the wide belt of semi-arid land stretching across the continent just south of the desert. The Nile Valley was particularly attractive. Fed by the seasonal floods of the White Nile from the south and the Blue Nile from the Ethiopian highlands, it provided fertile soils for crops such as barley, wheat, and flax. By the middle of the 4th millennium before the Common Era, farming villages lined its banks, each with its own fields, livestock pens, and storage pits. Here, people began to organize themselves in more complex ways. The annual flood demanded cooperation, measuring land boundaries, maintaining irrigation channels, and storing surplus grain for lean years. Leadership roles began to emerge, not only for hunting or warfare, but also for managing resources and resolving disputes. In the western Sahel, along the edges of the shrinking Sahara, similar processes unfolded. Communities adapted to the drier conditions by combining pastoralism with seasonal farming. This way of life allowed them to move herds to fresh grazing while cultivating crops when the rains came. The Sahel also became a natural corridor for movement, linking North Africa to the forests of the Guinea coast. Though we are still many centuries from the great trans-Saharan trade routes, the foundations for those connections were being laid as people, goods, and ideas slowly moved along these corridors. Farther south, in the regions that are now Nigeria and Cameroon, the early ancestors of the Nok culture were beginning to settle. Archaeological evidence suggests that by about 2,000 years before the Common Era, they were cultivating yams, oil palm, and other native crops. This was part of a wider phenomenon scholars call the African Agricultural Revolution, a series of independent domestications of plants and animals in different parts of the continent. In the Ethiopian highlands, farmers were cultivating teff and enset. In the Sahel, pearl millet and sorghum became staple crops. In West Africa, the cultivation of African rice began in the inland delta of the Niger River. These developments had a cumulative effect. More reliable food production supported larger populations. Larger populations, in turn, required more structured leadership. Kin-based societies, where authority was held by elders or clan leaders, began to give way to more centralized forms of organization. In some places, fortified settlements appeared, protecting people from raiding or competition over land and water. In others, sacred leaders emerged, combining political authority with spiritual duties. These early forms of rulership were not yet kingdoms in the full sense, but they were the first steps toward statehood. One of the clearest early examples of this transition comes from the region of Nubia, to the south of Egypt. Archaeologists have found evidence of small but organized polities along the Nile as early as the 5th millennium before the Common Era. These communities engaged in long-distance exchange, trading incense, ivory, and exotic skins with neighbors upstream and downstream. Leadership here may have been tied to control over these trade routes and access to valuable resources. Technology also played a role in shaping early statecraft. By around 4,000 years before the Common Era, copper working had begun in parts of North Africa, and gold ornaments appear in burials along the Nile. Metal tools allowed for more efficient farming, while metal weapons gave leaders new means of asserting power. In the Western Sahel, though metallurgy arrived later, the gradual improvement of stone tools, pottery styles, and building techniques reflected a broader pattern of innovation. We must also consider the role of belief and shared culture in binding these communities together. Rock art from the Sahara during the humid phase shows scenes of cattle herding, dancing, and ritual gatherings. These images suggest that even before large states emerged, people shared symbolic systems that reinforced social bonds. Leaders may have gained authority not only through control of resources, but also through their role in maintaining these traditions and mediating between the human and spiritual worlds. As the Sahara continued to dry, the migrations it triggered became one of the great shaping forces in African history. Groups moved in all directions, west toward the Atlantic coast, east into the Nile Valley, and south into the savannas and forests. This gradual, centuries-long dispersal helped spread farming, herding, and metallurgy across vast areas. It also set the stage for the later Bantu migrations, which would transform the linguistic and cultural map of sub-Saharan Africa. By the end of the 4th millennium before the Common Era, several regions of Africa were already showing the hallmarks of early statecraft: permanent settlements, surplus food production, specialized labor, long-distance trade, and centralized leadership. While these developments were not uniform, some areas remained organized in smaller, kin-based communities. They provided the political and economic foundation upon which later kingdoms would be built. The story of Africa's kingdoms cannot be understood without these beginnings. The adaptation to shifting climates, the creation of new farming systems, the management of herds and harvests, and the forging of trade links all created the conditions in which larger and more complex political systems could thrive. The leaders who emerged in this age did not yet command vast armies or monumental capitals, but they oversaw the first organized societies that would eventually give rise to the continent's great civilizations. With these foundations in place, we can now turn to the Nile Valley in the centuries that followed, where the idea of kingship itself would take on a new and enduring form. In the lower reaches of the Nile, The shift from scattered farming villages to centralized authority accelerated during the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. The fertile floodplains, enriched annually by silt from the river's inundation, had already sustained dense populations. But managing this environment required coordination beyond the capacity of small, autonomous communities. It was in this context that the first unified Egyptian state emerged, a political system that would endure, in one form or another, for more than 3 millennia. Before unification, Egypt was divided into 2 cultural and political zones. In the north, the Delta region, known as Lower Egypt, was a flat, marshy expanse fed by multiple branches of the Nile. In the south, Upper Egypt was a narrow valley hemmed in by desert cliffs. Both regions had distinct traditions in pottery, burial customs, and material culture. Archaeological finds from sites such as Nakata and Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt show increasingly complex societies with craft specialization, large-scale architecture, and evidence of social stratification. Competition between local chieftains likely intensified as populations grew and trade networks expanded. Upper Egypt's leaders appear to have gained the upper hand by controlling key routes to the south, tapping into resources from Nubia, and perhaps securing prestige goods from as far away as the Levant. The decisive step came when a ruler, remembered in later tradition as Narmer, consolidated power over both Upper and Lower Egypt around the year 3100 before the Common Era. The so-called Narmer palette, a carved ceremonial stone found at Hierakonpolis, offers a symbolic account of this unification. On one side, Narmer is shown wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down an enemy. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, inspecting rows of beheaded foes. While stylized and propagandistic, this artifact captures an essential truth. The first Egyptian kingship was born in conquest, but it endured through administration. Once unified, the new state developed a centralized bureaucracy. Land was surveyed and taxed, grain stored in state granaries, and labor conscripted for building and irrigation projects. This bureaucracy was staffed by officials loyal to the king, many drawn from elite families who owed their status to royal favor. To record and transmit orders, scribes used an emerging writing system, hieroglyphs, which likely evolved from earlier symbolic and pictographic traditions. The first preserved examples date to this period, inscribed on ivory tags, pottery, and stone. The king was not merely a political ruler, he was the embodiment of divine order, the earthly representative of the god Horus and, in later tradition, the son of the sun god Ra. This divine kingship linked political authority to cosmic stability. In Egyptian thought, the king's role was to maintain ma'at, a concept encompassing truth, justice, and the harmonious balance of the universe. This idea gave the king's decrees moral as well as practical weight, and it shaped how the people understood the legitimacy of their government. The early dynastic period, spanning roughly from 3100 to 2600 before the Common Era, saw the consolidation of royal power. Capitals were established at cities such as Memphis, strategically located at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. From here, the kings could oversee both the agricultural heartland and the routes leading to distant trade partners. Egypt's early rulers organized expeditions to secure resources: copper from the Sinai Peninsula, timber from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, and exotic goods from the Red Sea coast. Monumental architecture became a hallmark of this new state. Though the famous pyramids came later, early kings were already constructing large, elaborate tombs known as mastabas, built of mud brick and stone. These tombs, along with their grave goods, reflected the belief in an afterlife where the king would continue to reign. The resources required to build them, stone cutting, transport, food for workers, demonstrated the state's ability to mobilize and sustain large labor forces. The Old Kingdom, which began around 2600 before the Common Era, marked the next stage in pharaonic kingship. The kings of the Fourth Dynasty, such as Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, commissioned the Great Pyramids at Giza. These structures were both royal tombs and political statements, visible from miles away, proclaiming the ruler's divine power. The scale of these projects required not slave labor, as is sometimes imagined, but organized corvée labor. Ordinary farmers working for the state during the agricultural off-season, fed and housed in purpose-built workers' villages. The prosperity of the Old Kingdom rested on the Nile's predictable floods and the efficiency of the administration. Surpluses allowed for patronage of artisans, priests, and scribes, and the court became a center of culture and innovation. Statues, relief carvings, and inscriptions celebrated the king's achievements, reinforcing his role as the guarantor of order. At the same time, the temples dedicated to the gods grew in wealth and influence, as the king's religious duties required elaborate rituals and offerings. Over time, however, the balance between central and local power began to shift. Provincial governors, known as nomarchs, gained authority in their regions, sometimes passing their positions to their sons. While still nominally loyal to the king, they managed local resources and maintained their own power bases. This decentralization, combined with a series of low Nile floods in the 22nd century before the Common Era, undermined the central government's capacity. By around 2100 before the Common Era, the Old Kingdom had given way to what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time when regional rulers asserted independence and competing dynasties ruled from different cities. Though often portrayed as chaotic, this era also saw local cultural flourishing, as art and literature developed in styles distinct from the royal court. It was a reminder that while the institution of pharaonic kingship was powerful, it was not invulnerable. The Middle Kingdom, beginning around 2000 BCE, restored centralized rule under kings from the city of Thebes. These rulers, such as Mentuhotep II and Amenemhat III, strengthened the administration, reasserted control over Nubia, and expanded irrigation works. The ideology of kingship also evolved. The pharaoh was still divine, but inscriptions and literature from this period suggest a more paternal image, emphasizing the king's responsibility to protect and provide for his people. Trade and diplomacy flourished during the Middle Kingdom. Egyptian merchants and envoys traveled to the Levant, Punt, likely in the region of modern Eritrea or Somalia, and deep into Nubia. Fortresses were built along the Nile to secure these southern territories and to control the flow of goods, especially gold, ivory, and exotic animal products. These contacts linked Egypt more closely to the wider African and Near Eastern world, laying the groundwork for the interactions that would shape the continent's later history. The period also left a rich legacy of literature, from instructional texts for scribes to stories like The Tale of Sinue, which explored themes of loyalty, exile, and the king's mercy. Such works not only entertained, but also reinforced the cultural values that underpinned the state. Education, centered on mastery of writing and calculation, became a pathway to service in the bureaucracy, allowing talented individuals from outside the elite to rise in rank. By the close of the Middle Kingdom, the idea of pharaonic kingship was deeply entrenched. The king was the linchpin of the political and religious system, the focus of loyalty, and the symbol of national unity. Even when central power weakened, as it did again in the Second Intermediate Period, the ideal of the pharaoh endured. It was a model that would influence other African polities along the Nile, most notably the kingdoms of Nubia, which would in time produce rulers who claimed the pharaonic legacy as their own. South of Egypt, along the Great Bend of the Nile, lay a land rich in gold, copper, and other resources that the pharaohs coveted. This region, known to the ancient Egyptians as Kush, has been home to some of Africa's earliest and most enduring kingdoms. While the Nile was the central lifeline, Nubia's geography gave it a distinct identity, a mix of fertile riverbanks, rugged deserts, and trade routes stretching deep into the African interior. By the beginning of the second millennium before the Common Era, the first major Nubian state had emerged around the city of Kerma, located near the third cataract of the Nile. Archaeological evidence from this site reveals a sophisticated urban center with monumental mud brick buildings, well-planned residential areas, and large cemeteries containing rich grave goods. The wealth buried with Kerma's elite, gold ornaments, imported pottery, and finely crafted weapons, speaks of a society deeply involved in long-distance trade. Kerma's power came from its strategic position. It controlled the flow of goods between Central Africa and Egypt. From the south came gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animal skins. From the north came manufactured goods, such as linen, jewelry, and metal tools. Caravans and boats carried these items along well-established routes, and the rulers of Kerma taxed and regulated the exchange. In this way, they amassed wealth and influence without needing to expand their territory far beyond the river valley. Relations with Egypt were complex and often tense. During Egypt's Middle Kingdom, trade between the two regions was generally peaceful, with Egyptian officials establishing outposts to monitor commerce. But as Egypt's power waned during the Second Intermediate Period, Kerma grew more assertive. There is evidence that Kerma may have allied with the Hyksos, the foreign rulers who controlled northern Egypt at the time, against the southern Egyptian kingdom based in Thebes. When the Thebans eventually reunited Egypt in the 17th century before the Common Era, they turned their attention southward, seeing Kerma as both a threat and a source of vital resources. The New Kingdom pharaohs launched a series of military campaigns into Nubia, eventually conquering Kerma and incorporating its territory into the Egyptian Empire. For several centuries, Nubia was administered directly by Egyptian governors. Temples were built to Egyptian gods, Egyptian became the language of administration, and the elite adopted Egyptian customs. Yet this was not a simple story of cultural replacement. Nubian traditions endured, especially in rural areas, and over time, Nubians rose to important positions within the Egyptian state, serving as soldiers, administrators, and even royal advisors. By the end of the second millennium before the Common Era, Egypt's grip on Nubia began to loosen. The decline of the New Kingdom left a power vacuum, and Nubian leaders seized the opportunity to reassert independence. This marked the rise of the Napatan Kingdom, centered near the site of Napata, just downstream from the Fourth Cataract. Napata became the political and religious heart of a revitalized Kushite state. The kings of Napata saw themselves not only as heirs to Kerma's legacy but also as rightful inheritors of the pharaonic tradition. This connection to Egypt was not mere imitation. Napatan rulers embraced Egyptian religious forms, particularly the worship of Amun, but blended them with local Nubian practices. The Great Temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal, near Napata, became a major pilgrimage site, and its priests played a key role in legitimizing the king's authority. Art and architecture from this period show a fusion of styles, pyramids built for royal burials, but on a smaller and steeper scale than those of Egypt, alongside distinctly Nubian decorative motifs. Napata's influence extended northward, and in the 8th century before the Common Era, the Kushite kings took advantage of political instability in Egypt to intervene directly. Under King Paye, they launched a military campaign that brought all of Egypt under Kushite control. This was the beginning of Egypt's 25th dynasty, often called the Kushite dynasty. For nearly a century, Kushite pharaohs ruled from the Nile Delta to the Sixth Cataract, presenting themselves as restorers of traditional Egyptian religion and culture after what they portrayed as a time of decline. The reign of Taharqa, one of the most famous Kushite rulers, was marked by ambitious building projects across both Egypt and Nubia. He renovated temples, sponsored monumental inscriptions, and reinforced the authority of the Amun priesthood. Internationally, however, the Kushite dynasty faced growing threats, especially from the Assyrian Empire in the Near East. A series of military confrontations eventually forced the Kushite rulers to withdraw from Egypt, retreating to their Nubian heartland by the mid-7th century before the Common Era. This withdrawal did not mark the end of the kingdom. Instead, the center of power gradually shifted farther south to the city of Meroe, located between the 5th and 6th cataracts. Meroe was better positioned for agriculture thanks to more reliable rainfall than the arid regions farther north, and it lay closer to trade routes leading into sub-Saharan Africa. Over time, Meroe developed a distinct identity, less tied to Egyptian traditions and more reflective of indigenous Nubian culture. One of Meroe's most notable features was its mastery of iron production. Archaeological excavations have uncovered massive slag heaps, evidence of large-scale smelting and forging. This technological advantage supported both the economy and the military, allowing Meroe to equip its armies and produce tools for agriculture and crafts. Iron goods, along with gold and other resources, became important exports. The Meroitic script, developed around the 3rd century before the Common Era, marked another step in cultural independence. While it drew some inspiration from Egyptian writing, it represented a unique alphabetic system adapted to the Nubian language. Though not yet fully deciphered, inscriptions in Meroitic appear on monuments, temple walls, and pottery, showing that literacy extended beyond the religious and administrative elite. Meroe's art and architecture blended influences from Egypt, the Mediterranean, and Inner Africa. Its pyramids, though smaller than their Egyptian counterparts, were built in large numbers, serving as royal tombs for centuries. Decorative motifs on these structures, as well as on temple reliefs, show African animals, local deities, and scenes of daily life alongside more familiar Egyptian imagery. This synthesis reflected Meroe's role as a cultural crossroads, where ideas from different regions met and merged. By the first centuries of the Common Era, Meroe faced new challenges. Trade routes shifted as Roman Egypt sought alternate sources of African goods through the Red Sea, bypassing some of Meroe's overland networks. Internal pressures, perhaps from overuse of resources or political divisions, may have weakened the state. In the 4th century, Meroe's political dominance came to an end, likely due in part to incursions by the Kingdom of Aksum, rising in the Ethiopian highlands. Yet the legacy of Kerma, Napata, and Meroe was profound. These kingdoms demonstrated that complex, centralized states could flourish along the Nile without being mere extensions of Egypt. They adapted to changing political and environmental conditions, maintained long-distance trade, and developed distinctive cultural identities. Their history is a reminder that the Nile Valley's story is not only that of the pharaohs, but also of African kingdoms that carved out their own place in the ancient world. The 8th century before the Common Era brought an extraordinary reversal of the political relationship between Nubia and Egypt. For centuries, Egyptian armies had marched south to impose their will on Nubian lands, extracting tribute, controlling trade, and stationing governors. Now, in a remarkable turn of events, it was the kings of Kush, ruling from Napata, who would march north and claim the Egyptian throne for themselves. This was not a brief raid or symbolic gesture. It was the establishment of a dynasty that ruled a united Nile Valley from the delta to the southern cataracts, projecting African power deep into the political affairs of the ancient Near East. The roots of this reversal lay in Egypt's instability. Following the decline of the New Kingdom, Egypt had entered a long era of fragmentation. By the 8th century before the Common Era, the delta in Lower Egypt was divided among rival princes, while in Upper Egypt, Thebes and its powerful priesthood of Amun exercised de facto independence. This political disunity left Egypt vulnerable to outside influence, and the kings of Kush were in a position to take advantage. The Kushite ruler Kashta, whose reign began in the mid-8th century, made the first decisive move. Without the massive battles often associated with conquest, Kashta extended his authority into Upper Egypt through diplomacy, alliances, and religious legitimacy. He placed his daughter, Amenirtis, as the god's wife of Amun in Thebes, a position of enormous spiritual and political influence. This strategic placement was a masterstroke, embedding Kushite authority within the heart of Egyptian religious life. Kashta's successor, Piye, took the process much further. Around the year 725 before the Common Era, Piye launched a full military campaign to bring all of Egypt under his rule. His own account of this conquest survives on the famous Victory Stela, a monumental inscription that combines detailed reporting with royal propaganda. Piye describes sailing north from Napata, rallying loyal cities, and defeating rival rulers in the delta. He emphasizes that he fought not merely for territorial gain, but to restore proper worship of the god Amun, which he claimed had been neglected by Egypt's fragmented rulers. Once victorious, Piye returned to Napata rather than settle permanently in Egypt. This decision reflected both tradition and practicality. Napata remained the sacred and political center of the Kushite state, and the new pharaoh could govern Egypt through appointed officials and loyal allies while maintaining his own base in Nubia. Nevertheless, Piye's campaign marked the start of the 25th dynasty in Egyptian history, a period during which the Nile Valley was ruled by African kings from Kush. The Kushite pharaohs adopted the full regalia and titulary of Egyptian kingship, presenting themselves as the legitimate heirs of the pharaonic tradition. At the same time, they did not erase their Nubian identity. Royal art from this period shows pharaohs with distinctly Nubian features and wearing both Egyptian and Kushite styles of dress. In temple reliefs, they appear offering to Egyptian gods alongside depictions of their devotion to deities venerated in Nubia. This blending of traditions was not a compromise but a confident statement of dual heritage. Under Piye's successors, Shabaka, Shebitku, and most famously Taharqa, the Kushite dynasty embarked on ambitious building programs. Temples were restored and expanded across Egypt, from Karnak in Thebes to sites in the Delta. In Nubia, monumental works at Jebel Barkal and other sacred locations reinforced the religious foundation of their rule. The reign of Taharqa, in particular, was marked by prosperity and international engagement. Biblical sources mention him as an ally in the politics of the Levant, where Egypt and Kush sought to counter the expansion of the Assyrian Empire. Taharqa's rule coincided with a time of both opportunity and danger. To the northeast, the Assyrians were building a military machine unlike anything the region had seen before, conquering city after city in Mesopotamia and the Levant. Egyptian and Kushite interests inevitably clashed with Assyrian ambitions, particularly over the control of key trade routes and vassal states in the eastern Mediterranean. Initially, Taharqa supported coalitions of Levantine states resisting Assyrian domination, but the Assyrians proved relentless. In the early 7th century before the Common Era, Assyrian armies invaded Egypt. They advanced with brutal speed, capturing Memphis and forcing Taharqa to retreat to the south. Though he returned to fight again, the Assyrians struck hard a second time, eventually installing their own vassal rulers in the Delta. Taharqa's successor, Tantamani, attempted to reclaim the north, winning a temporary victory before being driven back once more by the Assyrians. By the year 656 before the Common Era, Kushite rule in Egypt had ended. The dynasty retreated to Napata, where it continued to govern a powerful Nubian kingdom. The expulsion from Egypt did not diminish the prestige of the Kushite kings at home. In fact, the experience of ruling Egypt reinforced their authority within Nubia. They had stood as equals among the great powers of the ancient world, engaging diplomatically and militarily with empires from the Levant to Mesopotamia. Their architectural and artistic legacy was visible across the Nile Valley, and their religious reforms had strengthened the central role of Amun in both Nubian and Egyptian life. One of the remarkable aspects of the Kushite period in Egypt is the degree to which it redefined the flow of influence along the Nile. For centuries, Egypt had been the dominant partner, shaping Nubia through conquest, administration, and cultural influence. The 25th dynasty turned that pattern on its head. Now it was Nubia setting the agenda, infusing Egypt with its own political vision and restoring elements of tradition that had lapsed during the centuries of division. This episode also complicates older narratives about the direction of cultural exchange in antiquity. It was not simply a case of ideas and institutions flowing from the civilized north to the peripheral south. The Kushite pharaohs demonstrate that Africa's interior could generate its own powerful states, capable of projecting influence into one of the world's oldest civilizations and reshaping its course. Even after the Assyrian withdrawal and the rise of new Egyptian dynasties under native rulers, Kush remained a formidable kingdom. The Napatan state would eventually shift its capital farther south to Meroe, ushering in a new chapter of Nubian history that emphasized ironworking, trade with the African interior, and a distinct cultural identity. But the memory of the time when Nubian kings ruled as pharaohs lived on in Egypt, in Nubia, and in the written records of neighboring regions. The 25th dynasty stands as a rare moment when political power along the Nile ran from south to north, a reminder that the Nile Valley's history is one of shifting balances, not permanent hierarchies. While the Nile Valley was experiencing the ebb and flow of Egyptian and Nubian power, a very different kind of African kingdom was emerging far to the west along the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Here, in the central coastal region of what is now Tunisia, a city would rise that would become one of the greatest maritime powers of the ancient world, Carthage. Its influence would extend far beyond its own walls, shaping the politics, trade, and warfare of the Mediterranean for centuries. Surrounding it, and in many ways shaping its destiny, were the Berber peoples of North Africa, whose kingdoms and confederations played decisive roles in the region's history. Carthage's origins lay in the wider story of Phoenician expansion. The Phoenicians were seafaring merchants from the Levant, centered in the cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, on the coast of what is now Lebanon. Renowned for their shipbuilding, navigation, and trade networks, the Phoenicians established colonies throughout the Mediterranean beginning in the early first millennium before the Common Era. According to tradition, Carthage was founded by settlers from Tyre around the late 9th century before the Common Era. The legend recorded by later Greco-Roman writers speaks of Queen Dido, a Tyrian princess who fled political intrigue in her homeland and led her followers to establish a new city on the North African coast. While this story cannot be confirmed as literal history, archaeological evidence supports the idea of an early Phoenician settlement at Carthage during this period. From its beginnings, Carthage had several key advantages. Its location offered a natural harbor, fertile hinterlands for agriculture, and proximity to important trade routes connecting the western and eastern Mediterranean. The city quickly grew into a hub for maritime commerce, dealing in goods such as silver from Iberia, tin from Britain, wine and olive oil from the central Mediterranean, and grain from North Africa. Carthaginian merchants also traded for gold, ivory, and other products from sub-Saharan Africa, using overland routes that passed through Berber-controlled territories. The political system of Carthage was distinctive. Although it began as a colony of Tyre, it soon became independent, governed by a combination of elected magistrates known as suffet, a council of elders, and an assembly of citizens. This structure allowed for a high degree of stability and flexibility, enabling the city to respond quickly to commercial opportunities and military threats. Carthage also developed a strong navy, which not only protected its trade routes, but also allowed it to project power across the Mediterranean. The Berber peoples, known to the Greeks and Romans as Libyans or Numidians depending on their location, were not a single unified group, but rather a collection of tribes and kingdoms spread across the Maghreb. They practiced a mix of pastoralism, agriculture, and trade, and their cavalry skills became legendary. Berber leaders often acted as both allies and rivals to Carthage, supplying it with horses, troops, and access to inland trade routes, while also competing for influence and resources. Over time, Carthage expanded its control over parts of the North African coast and islands in the western Mediterranean, including Sardinia, Corsica, and parts of Sicily. This expansion inevitably brought it into conflict with another rising power, Rome. The struggle between these two states became one of the defining geopolitical rivalries of the ancient world, known collectively as the Punic Wars. The First Punic War, fought in the 3rd century before the Common Era, was primarily a naval conflict over control of Sicily. Although Carthage had superior naval experience, Rome's relentless shipbuilding and adaptation to sea warfare eventually gave it the edge. The war ended with Carthage losing Sicily and paying a large indemnity, but the city remained a major power. It was during the Second Punic War that Carthage produced one of history's most celebrated military leaders, Hannibal Barca. Born into a prominent family, Hannibal was trained from a young age in both Carthaginian and Berber military traditions. In 218 before the Common Era, he launched an audacious campaign against Rome by marching his army, including war elephants, across the Alps. His victories at battles such as Cannae demonstrated brilliant tactical skill. But despite years of campaigning in Italy, he was unable to deliver a final blow to Rome. Eventually, Roman forces under Scipio Africanus carried the war to North Africa, forcing Hannibal to return and fight at the decisive Battle of Zama in 202 before the Common Era, where Carthage was defeated. After its loss in the Second Punic War, Carthage was stripped of its overseas territories and military power, but it remained economically vibrant. The city's agricultural innovations, particularly in the cultivation of grain, olives, and fruit, were widely admired. Its estates, managed with careful irrigation and crop rotation, became models for efficiency. This agricultural wealth allowed Carthage to recover economically, but its resurgence worried Rome, leading to renewed tensions. The Third Punic War, in the mid-2nd century before the Common Era, was short but devastating. Rome besieged Carthage for 3 years, eventually breaching its walls in 146 before the Common Era. The city was destroyed, its surviving inhabitants sold into slavery, and its territory annexed as the Roman province of Africa. Yet even in ruin, Carthage's legacy endured, in the agricultural systems it developed, the trade networks it maintained, and the cultural exchanges it fostered between Africa, Europe, and the Near East. Meanwhile, the Berber kingdoms to the west and south were far from passive bystanders in this era. The kingdom of Numidia, in particular, rose to prominence under leaders such as Massinissa. Initially allied with Carthage, Massinissa shifted his allegiance to Rome during the Second Punic War, a move that brought him new territories and recognition as king of a unified Numidia. Under his rule, Numidia became a major power in its own right, blending Berber traditions with elements of Mediterranean governance. Numidian cavalry became an indispensable part of Roman armies, valued for their speed, maneuverability, and skill in skirmish warfare. After Massinissa's death, however, Numidia was drawn into internal disputes and conflicts with Rome, notably during the reign of King Jugurtha. Jugurtha's resistance to Roman encroachment in the late 2nd century before the Common Era led to a protracted war that tested Rome's military and political systems. Although Jugurtha was eventually captured and executed, his defiance became a symbol of North African resilience. Farther west, the Kingdom of Mauritania, encompassing parts of modern Morocco and western Algeria, maintained its independence for much of this period. Its rulers navigated the shifting alliances between Carthage, Rome, and other Mediterranean powers, using diplomacy and control of valuable coastal and inland trade to preserve their autonomy. Mauritania would eventually be absorbed into the Roman Empire, but not until the 1st century of the Common Era. The interplay between Carthage and the Berber kingdoms reveals a pattern that would recur throughout African history: the dynamic exchange between coastal, maritime powers and inland, land-based states. Carthage's success depended not only on its ships and merchants, but also on the resources and military skills of its Berber neighbors. In turn, the Berber kingdoms leveraged their connections with Carthage and later Rome to expand their influence, sometimes as partners, sometimes as rivals. On the high plateaus of what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, a new African kingdom emerged at the dawn of the Common Era. Known to the ancient world as Aksum, it would grow into one of the most important powers of its time, commanding the trade of the Red Sea, minting its own coins, and developing a written script unique to its people. Aksum's influence stretched from the African interior to the coasts of Arabia and the ports of India, making it a central player in the interconnected world of late antiquity. The roots of Aksum lay in earlier highland communities that had mastered terraced agriculture, built stone structures, and engaged in regional trade. By the 1st century of the Common Era, these communities had coalesced into a centralized kingdom with its capital at the city of Aksum. The city's location was a strategic choice. It lay inland for security, yet close enough to the Red Sea via the port of Adulis to participate fully in international commerce. Adulis became Aksum's maritime gateway. Ships from Egypt, the eastern Mediterranean, southern Arabia, and India docked here to exchange goods. From Africa came gold, ivory, frankincense, myrrh, rhinoceros horn, and exotic animal skins. In return, Aksum imported silk, spices, glassware, wine, and precious metals. The kingdom's position allowed it to act as a broker between the African interior and the great empires of Rome, Persia, and India. Control over this trade brought wealth, and wealth brought political power. Aksumite rulers used their resources to expand their territory, incorporating neighboring regions through a combination of diplomacy and military force. Inscriptions from this period, written in the ancient Ge'ez script, record royal campaigns into surrounding lowlands and across the Red Sea into Arabia. One notable example comes from King Gdrt, possibly pronounced Gadarat, who appears in inscriptions in Yemen, demonstrating Aksum's reach into the affairs of the Arabian Peninsula. The kingdom's coinage is one of the clearest signs of its sophistication and international integration. Beginning in the 3rd century of the Common Era, Aksum minted gold, silver, and bronze coins bearing the names and images of its kings. These coins often featured inscriptions in Greek, the lingua franca of Eastern Mediterranean trade, as well as in Ge'ez. They circulated widely, turning up in archaeological sites from India to the Levant. The decision to issue coins in multiple metals allowed Aksum to facilitate transactions at different economic levels, from large-scale trade deals to local market exchanges. Religion played a central role in Aksumite society, evolving significantly over time. In its early centuries, Aksum's rulers and people practiced a polytheistic faith that included local deities and possibly South Arabian influences. However, by the 4th century, the kingdom experienced a momentous transformation. King Ezana, one of Aksum's most celebrated rulers, converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the first states in the world to adopt the religion officially. The move was influenced in part by contact with Christian communities in the Roman Empire and possibly by missionaries from the Eastern Mediterranean. Ezana's conversion had profound consequences. Crosses began to appear on Aksumite coins, replacing earlier religious symbols. Churches were built, and Christianity became intertwined with the authority of the monarchy. This new identity also aligned Aksum more closely with the Christian world, strengthening ties with the Byzantine Empire and other Christian powers. At the same time, Aksum's rulers maintained a degree of tolerance for other faiths, particularly in their dealings with Jewish and polytheistic trading partners. Monumental architecture became a hallmark of Aksumite culture. The most striking examples are the massive stelae, towering stone monuments carved from single pieces of granite. Some of these stelae, such as the one known as the Great Stele, originally stood over 30 meters high. They were intricately decorated with false doors and windows, imitating the multi-story palaces of the living. These monuments served as markers for royal tombs, projecting both the power of the rulers and the skill of their craftsmen. Aksum's prosperity rested on several pillars: control of Red Sea trade, agricultural productivity in the fertile highlands, and the ability to project military power into surrounding regions. However, by the 6th century, the kingdom faced new challenges. The rise of the Sasanian Persian Empire altered the balance of power in the Red Sea, as Persian allies in southern Arabia began to challenge Aksum's influence. The Aksumite king Caleb responded with a dramatic military expedition across the Red Sea, intervening in the kingdom of Himyar to protect Christian communities from persecution. Contemporary inscriptions and later chronicles describe Caleb's forces defeating the Himyarite ruler and installing a client king. For a time, this intervention reaffirmed Aksum's position as a regional power. Yet the strategic situation continued to shift. In the early 7th century, the emergence of Islam in Arabia transformed the Red Sea trade network. According to Islamic tradition, during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, a group of his followers sought refuge in the Aksumite kingdom to escape persecution in Mecca. The Aksumite ruler, known in Muslim sources as the Negus, granted them asylum, and they remained in his protection until it was safe to return. This episode is remembered as a moment of early interfaith diplomacy between Aksum and the nascent Muslim community. Despite these diplomatic ties, Aksum's economic position began to weaken in the 7th century. The shift of major trade routes, possibly influenced by changing political alliances and the silting of Adulis's harbor, reduced the kingdom's role in international commerce. At the same time, environmental changes may have affected agricultural productivity in the highlands. Gradually, Aksum's political and economic center of gravity shifted, and by the 8th century, its prominence on the world stage had faded. Even in decline, the cultural and religious legacy of Aksum endured. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its origins to Ezana's conversion, and the Ge'ez script continued to be used in liturgy and literature. The traditions of monumental stone architecture and royal Christian patronage would influence later Ethiopian states for centuries. Aksum's history demonstrates that African kingdoms were not isolated or peripheral in the ancient world. They were integral participants in the global systems of trade, religion, and diplomacy that connected continents. For thousands of years, the Sahara Desert stood as one of the most formidable barriers to sustained contact between North Africa and the lands to its south. While ancient Egyptians, Carthaginians, and Romans had made occasional forays into its edges, the vast expanse of shifting dunes, rocky plateaus, and searing heat prevented regular large-scale crossings. The few routes that did exist relied on hardy pack animals like donkeys or oxen, which could not carry heavy loads over long distances without frequent water. Trade between the Mediterranean and the Sahel, the wide belt of semi-arid grassland stretching just south of the desert, was limited to small caravans or coastal exchanges. Everything changed with the arrival and widespread adoption of the camel. Domesticated in the Arabian Peninsula centuries earlier, the single-humped dromedary was uniquely suited to desert travel. It could endure days without water, carry heavy loads, and navigate the harsh terrain with relative ease. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, camels had reached North Africa, likely brought across the Red Sea or through Egypt. At first, they were a curiosity, used in small numbers by desert-dwelling peoples. Over time, however, Berber communities in the northern Sahara began to master camel breeding and riding, transforming these animals into the foundation of a new trans-Saharan trade network. The camel's adoption revolutionized mobility. Caravans could now travel much farther between wells or oases, opening routes that had been impractical or impossible before. Berber traders, long accustomed to moving goods across shorter desert stretches, expanded their reach deep into the interior. The most important early hubs were the oases, which served as resting points, resupply stations, and centers of exchange. Towns like Ghadames in modern Libya or Tafilalt in Morocco became critical nodes in the emerging network, linking the Mediterranean coast with the Sahel. These new routes carried more than goods. They carried ideas, technologies, and people. Gold from the Niger River basin, salt from the Sahara's ancient lakebeds, and kola nuts from the forest zone began to move northward in larger and more regular quantities. In return, the South received copper, cloth, glassware, and increasingly horses, which would transform warfare and political power in the Sahel. The camel also made it possible for traders to bypass some of the traditional bottlenecks of the Nile Valley or coastal shipping, allowing inland states to rise as major players in continental trade. One of the most significant cultural developments of this period was the spread of Islam into the Sahara and the Sahel. The rise of Islam in the 7th century created a vast religious and cultural sphere stretching from the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the Indian Ocean. Muslim merchants and scholars traveling with caravans brought not only goods, but also new religious ideas, legal systems, and literacy in Arabic. At first, Islam's influence was strongest in the trading towns and among the merchant classes, who benefited from sharing a common faith with their North African counterparts. Over time, however, some rulers and elites in the Sahel began to convert, integrating Islamic practices into their governance while maintaining indigenous traditions. The spread of Islam also stimulated further growth in trade. Muslim merchants were able to draw on extensive networks that linked West Africa to the wider Islamic world. Goods that reached the Mediterranean could be shipped to Egypt, the Levant, Arabia, or even further afield to India and China. Likewise, imports from as far away as Persia or Central Asia could find their way to the markets of the Niger Bend or Lake Chad. The trans-Saharan routes thus became part of a much larger system of Afro-Eurasian exchange. Caravan trade was not without risks. The Sahara remained a perilous environment where sudden sandstorms, scarce water, and extreme heat could be deadly. Banditry was a constant concern, and traders often had to negotiate safe passage through the territories of various nomadic or semi-nomadic groups. To manage these challenges, caravans traveled in large, organized groups, sometimes numbering hundreds or even thousands of camels. These massive trains were coordinated by experienced caravan leaders who knew the routes, the locations of wells, and the customs of the peoples along the way. The growing scale of trans-Saharan trade also had significant political effects. Control of an oasis, a section of a caravan route, or a major market town could bring great wealth and influence. Berber confederations, often organized along tribal lines, became powerful intermediaries, taxing caravans or providing protection for a fee. Over time, some of these groups began to establish more permanent political structures, laying the groundwork for future North African states such as the Almoravid Empire. In the Sahel, increased trade opportunities encouraged the rise of larger, more centralized states capable of organizing production, protecting trade, and negotiating with distant partners. The exchange of horses for gold and other goods had a particularly transformative impact, as mounted warriors could dominate the open savannas, allowing rulers to project power over greater distances. This interplay between commerce, military strength, and political authority would be a defining feature of the great Sahelian empires that emerged in the centuries to come. Religion and scholarship traveled alongside goods and political power. As Islam spread into Sahelian towns, mosques were built, Quranic schools established, and scholars began to circulate between West Africa and North Africa. Arabic literacy allowed for more sophisticated record-keeping and the preservation of local histories, laws, and traditions in written form. This intellectual exchange was not one-way. African scholars made contributions to theology, law, and science that resonated across the Islamic world. The period between the 3rd and 8th centuries thus marked a profound transformation in African history. The Sahara, once a formidable barrier, became a bridge linking the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan worlds. The camel was at the heart of this change, enabling a scale of movement and exchange that reshaped economies, societies, and cultures on both sides of the desert. The rise of trans-Saharan trade set the stage for the emergence of powerful states in the Sahel, whose wealth would come to depend on controlling the flow of gold, salt, and other commodities across this vast expanse. In the heart of the Western Sahel, between the Senegal and Niger rivers, a kingdom rose that would become the prototype for the great empires of West Africa. Known to its own people as Ouagadougou and to Arab writers as Ghana, this state thrived on the opportunities created by the new trans-Saharan trade system. By mastering the flow of goods between the goldfields of the southern forests and the salt mines of the northern desert, Ghana became one of the most prosperous and influential powers of its time. The origins of Ouagadougou stretch back to earlier centuries before the arrival of Islam in the region. The Soninka people, who formed the core of the kingdom, had long cultivated millet and sorghum, herded livestock, and engaged in regional trade. The gradual adoption of iron tools and weapons increased agricultural productivity and military capability. By the 7th century of the Common Era, these advantages had allowed certain Soninka clans to consolidate power over their neighbors, laying the foundations for a centralized state. The strategic location of Ghana was crucial to its rise. To the south lay the Bambouk and Bura gold fields, sources of some of the finest gold in the medieval world. To the north, across the Sahara, stretched the salt-rich regions of Tagaza and Taoudeni. Salt was as valuable as gold in many parts of West Africa, not only for seasoning, but also for preserving food and maintaining health in a hot climate. Ghana sat astride the trade routes that linked these two vital resources, controlling and taxing the exchange between desert and savanna. The ruling dynasty of Ouagadougou established its capital at Kumbi Saleh, a twin-city complex with distinct quarters for the royal court and for Muslim merchants. The royal city housed the king's palace, administrative buildings, and residences for officials and retainers. The merchant city, located nearby but separate, contained mosques, warehouses, and markets. This arrangement reflected the kingdom's pragmatic approach to religion and governance. While the kings maintained the traditional Soninka religion, they welcomed Muslim traders, granting them the freedom to practice Islam and operate under Islamic law in their own communities. Arab geographers and historians, such as al-Yaqubi in the 9th century and al-Bakri in the 11th, provide valuable, if sometimes idealized, descriptions of Ghana. They depict a powerful king surrounded by a well-equipped army, including a corps of archers and cavalry. The king's wealth was legendary, measured not only in gold, but also in the tribute of goods, livestock, and captives sent by subordinate chiefs. Gold nuggets of exceptional size were said to be reserved for the king alone, with dust gold serving as the medium of trade for others. Ghana's political system combined centralized authority with a network of vassal rulers. Local chiefs retained control over their own territories, but were bound by loyalty and tribute to the king. This arrangement allowed Ghana to govern a diverse and expansive realm without the need for constant military intervention. The king's court acted as the ultimate arbiter in disputes, and his authority was reinforced by a combination of military power, religious prestige, and control over trade. The integration of Ghana into the wider Islamic world through trade brought both opportunities and tensions. Muslim merchants from North Africa introduced new goods, such as fine textiles, copperware, and books, as well as new ideas in law, governance, and scholarship. Over time, some local elites converted to Islam, finding it advantageous for diplomacy and commerce. However, the royal dynasty itself appears to have remained committed to traditional beliefs for much of its history, maintaining a delicate balance between the two religious communities. This balance was a key factor in Ghana's success. By accommodating both traditions, the kingdom could draw on the economic and cultural benefits of Islamic connections without alienating its indigenous base of support. It also allowed Ghana to serve as a mediator between Muslim North Africa and the largely non-Muslim societies of the Forest Zone, controlling the flow of goods and information across the cultural boundary. The prosperity of Ghana reached its height between the 10th and early 12th centuries. The sheer scale of the gold trade is difficult to overstate. Gold from West Africa circulated in the markets of North Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe, where it was minted into coins and used to fund armies, palaces, and cathedrals. The wealth flowing through Ghana supported a sophisticated urban culture, with artisans producing metalwork, textiles, and leather goods for both local use and export. Yet, Ghana's dominance was not eternal. Several factors combined to undermine its power in the 12th century. One was the shifting pattern of trans-Saharan trade routes, which began to favor emerging centers farther east along the Niger River. Another was the growing influence of the Almoravids, a Berber Muslim reform movement based in the Western Sahara and Morocco. In the late 11th century, Almoravid forces campaigned in the Sahel, seeking to spread their interpretation of Islam and gain control over the gold trade. The extent of Almoravid involvement in Ghana's decline remains debated among historians. While some medieval sources credit them with a decisive conquest, archaeological evidence suggests a more complex picture, involving both external pressures and internal challenges. The spread of Islam among local elites may have altered the political balance within the kingdom, while environmental changes could have affected agricultural output. By the mid-12th century, Ghana's authority had weakened and its territory fragmented into smaller states. Some of its former subjects established new centers of power along the Niger River, laying the groundwork for the rise of the Mali Empire. Although Ghana itself faded from prominence, its legacy endured in the political models, trade systems, and cultural exchanges that shaped the Sahelian world for centuries to come. The story of Ghana marks the beginning of a distinct West African imperial tradition, one in which control of trade, rather than direct control of territory, was the primary source of wealth and influence. The empire's ability to bridge different cultures and faiths while maintaining internal stability set a precedent for the states that followed. When the Empire of Ghana fractured in the 12th century, the political and commercial balance of the Western Sahel shifted. Over the course of the next 100 years, new states rose and fell, each seeking to dominate the gold-rich lands and the lucrative trans-Saharan trade routes. Among these emerging powers, one would stand out for its extraordinary wealth, cultural achievements, and enduring legacy: the Mali Empire. Its rise was tied to the leadership of remarkable rulers, its strength anchored in control of commerce, and its fame carried across continents by the journeys of its most illustrious king. The roots of Mali lay in the Mande-speaking communities of the upper Niger River region, an area of fertile floodplains, rolling savannas, and abundant resources. These communities had long been involved in trade, agriculture, and ironworking, but it was political unity under a capable leader that transformed them into a regional power. According to oral tradition preserved by generations of griots, West African historians, poets, and musicians, this unity was forged by a figure named Sundiata Keita. Sundiata's story, told in the Epic of Sundiata, is both a historical account and a foundational legend. Born into a royal family but exiled in his youth, Sundiata is said to have overcome disability, personal loss, and political betrayal before returning to liberate his people from the rule of a rival king, Suma Oro Kante of the Soso. The decisive battle at Kirina, dated by some traditions to the early 13th century, marked the beginning of Mali's expansion. While the epic embellishes events with supernatural elements and moral lessons, its core reflects a genuine historical process: the consolidation of Mande clans into a centralized kingdom capable of projecting power over a wide area. Under Sundiata and his immediate successors, Mali expanded rapidly. Control of the Upper Niger allowed the empire to dominate key agricultural zones, while its armies secured trade routes linking the gold fields of Bambuk and Bure to the markets of the Sahel and beyond. The empire's political structure blended centralized authority with local autonomy. Provincial rulers, often drawn from allied or subordinate clans, managed their own territories but paid tribute and provided military support to the emperor, known as the Mansa. Mali's wealth grew from its command of trans-Saharan commerce. Gold was the foundation of this prosperity. The empire not only possessed rich deposits within its own territory, but also acted as the primary intermediary for gold mined farther south. Salt, transported from the Sahara in great slabs, was equally valuable and in constant demand. Other trade goods included copper from Takeda, kola nuts from the forest belt, and textiles woven from cotton cultivated in the Niger basin. Caravans carrying these goods passed through Mali's great market towns, where they were taxed, inspected, and protected by imperial authority. The political stability and commercial vitality of Mali created the conditions for urban growth. Cities such as Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne became centers of exchange, craftsmanship, and intellectual life. Timbuktu, founded as a seasonal camp by Tuareg nomads, grew into a thriving town at the intersection of caravan routes and river traffic. Jenne, situated on an island in the Niger inland delta, served as a hub for regional trade and a gateway to the forest zone. These urban centers attracted merchants from across West Africa, North Africa, and even farther afield, making Mali a cosmopolitan realm. The most famous ruler of Mali, Mansa Musa, came to the throne in the early 14th century. A devout Muslim and a shrewd statesman, Mansa Musa is remembered above all for his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in the year 1324. Traveling with a vast entourage, thousands of soldiers, officials, and servants, and dozens of camels laden with gold, Mansa Musa's journey became the stuff of global fascination. Chroniclers in Egypt and beyond marveled at the scale of his generosity. It was said that his lavish gifts of gold in Cairo caused the metal's value to decline for years. This pilgrimage was more than an expression of personal piety. It was a calculated display of Mali's power and prosperity to the wider Islamic world. Along the way, Mansa Musa forged diplomatic and scholarly connections, attracting architects, jurists, and teachers to his court. Upon returning to Mali, he embarked on an ambitious program of construction, commissioning mosques, palaces, and madrasas in cities such as Timbuktu and Gao. One of the most famous structures associated with his reign is the Jingwereber Mosque in Timbuktu, built with the guidance of the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. Mansa Musa's patronage transformed Mali into a center of Islamic learning. Timbuktu, in particular, emerged as a renowned seat of scholarship, home to thousands of students and extensive libraries. Manuscripts copied and studied there covered subjects ranging from theology and law to mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The city's scholars maintained correspondence with colleagues in North Africa, Egypt, and the Middle East, integrating West Africa into the intellectual currents of the wider Islamic world. While Islam played a central role in the political and cultural life of the empire's elite, Mali remained religiously diverse. Many rural communities continued to practice indigenous spiritual traditions, often blending them with Islamic practices. The Mansa was expected to respect and mediate between these traditions, reinforcing his role as a unifying figure across a vast and varied realm. Mali's prosperity rested on more than gold and learning. It also depended on effective governance and infrastructure. The empire's administration was sophisticated, with officials overseeing taxation, justice, and the maintenance of trade routes. A system of royal messengers ensured communication between the capital and distant provinces. The Niger River served as a vital artery, facilitating the movement of goods, people, and armies. Despite its strengths, Mali faced challenges in the later 14th century. The sheer size of the empire made it difficult to control distant provinces, and ambitious regional governors sometimes acted independently. Competition over succession could lead to instability at the center. External pressures also mounted as neighboring states sought to capture lucrative trade routes. The Mossi kingdoms to the south launched raids into the Niger Valley, while to the northeast, the Songhai kingdom began to reassert itself in the city of Gao. By the early 15th century, Mali's dominance had begun to wane. The loss of key territories and shifts in trade patterns weakened its economic base. Yet the empire's legacy endured long after its political decline. The image of Mali as a land of wealth, learning, and powerful rulers persisted in the imagination of both Africans and outsiders. Maps created by European cartographers in the 15th century often depicted a crowned African king holding a gold nugget, an iconographic tribute to the enduring fame of Mansa Musa and his realm. The Mali Empire stands as a testament to the capacity of African states to command vast resources, sustain complex urban cultures, and engage meaningfully with the wider world. Its blend of economic strength, cultural richness, and political adaptability set a standard for the Sahelian empires that followed. As Mali's influence began to fade in the early 15th century, the balance of power in the western Sahel shifted once again. Along the middle reaches of the Niger River, a state that had once been overshadowed by Mali was rising to prominence. This was Songhai, a kingdom whose heartland lay around the city of Gao. Over the course of the next century and a half, Songhai would grow into the largest empire in West African history, dominating trade, scholarship, and politics across a vast swath of the Sahel and Savannah. Its ascent, however, would be as dramatic as its eventual fall. Songhai's origins stretch back many centuries before its imperial zenith. Gao, its earliest center, had been a hub of regional trade since at least the 8th century, benefiting from its position along both trans-Saharan caravan routes and the navigable Niger River. Songhai's rulers initially operated as regional powers under the shadow of larger empires, first Ghana, then Mali. However, by the late 14th century, as Mali weakened, Songhai began to assert its independence. The turning point came under the leadership of Sunni Ali, who became ruler in the year 1464. Sunni Ali was a formidable military commander and an ambitious state builder. He recognized that controlling the Niger River was key to controlling the Sahel, and he set about securing its major cities and trade hubs. His forces combined cavalry, infantry, and a river navy, boats armed with archers that could strike swiftly along the waterways. This integration of land and river power gave Songhai a unique strategic advantage over its rivals. One of Sunni Ali's most notable achievements was the capture of Timbuktu in 1468. Although already renowned as a center of learning and commerce under Mali, the city had experienced instability due to Tuareg dominance and shifting alliances. Sunni Ali brought it firmly under Songhai's control, though not without controversy. Muslim scholars in Timbuktu criticized him for harsh treatment of the city's inhabitants, reflecting tensions between his pragmatic, often militaristic governance and the religious elite's expectations. Sunni Ali continued his campaigns relentlessly, expanding Songhai's territory along the Niger and into the inland delta. He took Djenné after a protracted siege lasting several years, securing another vital node in the regional trade network. By the time of his death in 1492, Sunni Ali had transformed Songhai from a regional kingdom into an empire that rivaled the earlier Mali in size and wealth. The succession after Sunni Ali's death was contested, but ultimately power passed to one of his generals, Muhammad Touré, who took the title Askia Muhammad. Under his leadership, Songhai entered a new phase of consolidation and reform. Askia Muhammad was a devout Muslim who sought to align the empire's governance more closely with Islamic principles without alienating the diverse peoples and traditions within its borders. Askia Muhammad reorganized the empire's administration into provinces, each governed by an appointed official responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and overseeing local justice. He established a more formalized system of tribute and ensured that revenue from trade and agriculture flowed into the imperial treasury. These reforms strengthened central authority and allowed the empire to manage its vast territories more effectively. Diplomatically, Askia Muhammad cultivated ties with the wider Islamic world. In 1526, he undertook the pilgrimage to Mecca, traveling with a large entourage and significant wealth. The journey, like Mansa Musa's a century earlier, was both a spiritual undertaking and a statement of Songhai's prestige. In Mecca, he met with scholars and religious leaders, enhancing his reputation as a ruler committed to Islamic learning and governance. He brought back jurists and clerics who helped standardize the application of Islamic law in the empire. Songhai's economy thrived under this stability. The gold trade remained central, but the empire also profited from the exchange of salt, copper, kola nuts, and agricultural products. Markets in Timbuktu, Gao, and Djenné bustled with activity, drawing merchants from across North Africa and beyond. Timbuktu's intellectual life flourished, supported by royal patronage. Its madrasas, most famously the Sankore University, attracted students from across the region. Libraries in the city housed thousands of manuscripts, covering subjects from theology and jurisprudence to mathematics, medicine, and history. Despite these strengths, the very size of Songhai posed challenges. Communication across such a vast empire was slow, and regional governors sometimes acted with a high degree of autonomy. Maintaining loyalty required a delicate balance of military strength, economic incentives, and respect for local traditions. Furthermore, the empire's prosperity made it an attractive target for external powers. The greatest threat came from the north. By the late 16th century, Morocco, under Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, sought to control the trans-Saharan trade in gold. The Moroccan state had recently profited from its victory over Portuguese forces at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir in 1578, and al-Mansur aimed to capitalize on this momentum. He commissioned the creation of a professional army equipped with firearms, including arquebuses and cannons, technology that was rare in the Sahel. In 1591, a Moroccan force under Juder Pasha, a Spanish-born Muslim serving the Sultan, crossed the Sahara. Though heavily outnumbered by Songhai's army, the Moroccans had a decisive technological edge. At the Battle of Tondibi near Gao, Songhai's traditional cavalry charges were shattered by gunfire. The defeat was catastrophic. Gao, Timbuktu, and Djenné fell in quick succession, and the imperial administration collapsed. Moroccan occupation, however, was limited in scope. The logistical difficulty of supplying and controlling territory so far from Marrakesh meant that effective governance broke down. Songhai's former provinces splintered into smaller states, and the once unified trans-Saharan trade system fragmented. Some successor states, like the Dendi Kingdom to the southeast, maintained aspects of Songhai's legacy. But the era of large, centralized Sahelian empires had come to an end. The rise and fall of Songhai illustrates both the potential and the vulnerability of river-based empires in the Sahel. Its leaders harnessed the strategic power of the Niger, integrated diverse economic and cultural systems, and projected influence deep into the desert and savanna. Yet its dependence on traditional military systems left it exposed to new technologies and distant ambitions. Along the eastern coast of Africa, from present-day southern Somalia to northern Mozambique, a chain of prosperous city-states emerged during the medieval period. Collectively known as the Swahili coast, these urban centers were neither isolated nor uniform. They were interconnected hubs of maritime trade, culture, and diplomacy, each with its own political leadership, yet bound together by a shared language, religion, and mercantile ethos. Their rise was closely tied to the Indian Ocean trade network, which linked Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and at times, even China. The foundations of Swahili urban life lay in centuries of interaction between coastal African communities and seafaring merchants from across the Indian Ocean. Archaeological evidence suggests that settlements along the coast were engaging in regional trade as early as the first millennium of the Common Era, exchanging goods like iron tools, agricultural produce, and local craftwork. Over time, contact with traders from the Arabian Peninsula and Persia increased, introducing new commodities, architectural styles, and religious ideas. By the 10th century, a distinct Swahili culture had taken shape, a synthesis of African and foreign influences. The Swahili language, a Bantu tongue enriched with vocabulary from Arabic and, later, Persian and Portuguese, became the medium of communication not only among coastal peoples, but also between Africans and visiting merchants. This shared language helped knit together a diverse set of city-states, from Mogadishu in the north to Sofala in the south. The city-states were typically built on islands, peninsulas, or coastal promontories, allowing them to control access to harbors while providing natural defenses. Stone architecture, introduced through contact with the Islamic world, became a hallmark of wealth and status. Coral rag, a type of limestone formed from coral reefs, was quarried and used to construct mosques, palaces, and merchant houses. By the 13th century, cities like Kilwa Kisiwani, Mombasa, and Lamu boasted impressive stone buildings, their design reflecting both African craftsmanship and Middle Eastern architectural influences. Islam was central to Swahili identity, though it coexisted with older African traditions. The religion was introduced gradually through trade and the settlement of Muslim merchants, rather than by conquest. By the 11th century, many of the coastal elites had converted, seeing in Islam not only spiritual meaning, but also a valuable link to the wider commercial and diplomatic networks of the Indian Ocean world. Mosques became focal points of urban life, and Islamic legal principles were often applied in trade agreements and dispute resolution. The prosperity of the Swahili city-states was built on their role as intermediaries between the African interior and the overseas markets of the Indian Ocean. Gold from the mines of Great Zimbabwe, ivory from East African elephants, and enslaved people captured in inland conflicts all flowed to the coast, where they were exchanged for goods such as Persian ceramics, Indian cotton textiles, Arabian coffee, and Chinese porcelain. In turn, imported goods traveled inland, influencing the material culture and consumption patterns of communities far from the sea. Among the Swahili city-states, Kilwa Kisiwani reached particular prominence. Situated on an island off the coast of modern Tanzania, Kilwa controlled the southern gold trade from Sofala and maintained direct links with the wealth of the Zimbabwe plateau. Its rulers commissioned ambitious building projects, including the Great Mosque of Kilwa and the Husuni Kubwa Palace, a sprawling complex of courtyards, storerooms, and audience halls. Contemporary visitors, such as the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta in the 14th century, described Kilwa as one of the most beautiful and well-constructed towns they had ever seen, praising its cleanliness, order, and flourishing markets. The Swahili city-states were not unified under a single ruler. Each was governed by its own sultan or council of merchant elites, and while they often cooperated in trade and defense, they also competed for control of resources and trade routes. Diplomacy was a vital tool, both among the cities themselves and in dealing with foreign powers. Marriage alliances between Swahili elites and visiting merchants from Arabia or Persia were common, cementing commercial relationships and integrating newcomers into local society. Relations with distant lands were maintained through regular voyages across the Indian Ocean, timed to the monsoon winds that blew predictably from one direction for half the year and the opposite direction for the other half. Ships known as dhows carried cargoes along these routes, their lateen sails allowing for both speed and maneuverability. Merchants from the Swahili coast traveled to ports in Yemen, Oman, Gujarat, and beyond, returning with luxury goods and news of political developments across the sea. The wealth generated by trade supported a sophisticated urban culture. Swahili society placed a high value on refinement in dress, language, and hospitality. Homes of the wealthy were adorned with imported pottery and glassware, and elaborate wooden doors carved with intricate designs became a distinctive feature of the architecture. Poetry, music, and storytelling thrived, often blending Islamic themes with local traditions. However, the prosperity of the Swahili coast also attracted the attention of expanding powers from outside the region. In the late 15th century, Portuguese explorers seeking a maritime route to the riches of Asia sailed down the East African coast. Initially interested in establishing trade relations, the Portuguese soon turned to coercion, using superior naval firepower to demand tribute from coastal cities. By the early 16th century, Portuguese fleets had attacked and occupied key ports, including Kilwa and Mombasa. Their goal was to control the Indian Ocean trade by dominating strategic points along its coasts. In some cities, such as Malindi, local rulers allied with the Portuguese to gain an advantage over rivals. In others, resistance was fierce, leading to cycles of siege and reprisal. The disruption of established trade networks weakened many city-states, although Swahili merchants continued to operate, often by avoiding Portuguese-controlled harbors or dealing with them under negotiated terms. The Portuguese presence along the Swahili coast was never absolute, and by the late 17th century, Omani Arab forces began to challenge and eventually displace them from much of the region. Omani rule brought new political dynamics, with some coastal cities becoming part of the Sultanate of Oman's maritime empire. This transition reinvigorated certain trade routes and reinforced the cultural ties between the Swahili coast and Arabia. But it also marked the end of the era when the city-states operated as fully independent powers. The Swahili city-states occupy a unique place in African history. They were African in origin and identity, yet profoundly cosmopolitan in outlook, serving as cultural and economic bridges between Africa and the wider world. Their success rested not on large territorial conquests, but on mastery of maritime trade, urban organization, and diplomatic skill. From these ocean-facing cities, our journey now turns inland to southern Africa, where another remarkable center of power, Great Zimbabwe, arose. There, in the highlands far from the sea, monumental stone walls and towers testified to a different kind of African statecraft, one rooted in control of land, livestock, and gold fields that fed into the very same Indian Ocean networks dominated by the Swahili coast. Far inland from the Indian Ocean coast, in the highlands of what is now southeastern Zimbabwe, rose one of the most extraordinary centers of statecraft and architecture in African history. Known today as Great Zimbabwe, this settlement flourished between the 12th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, serving as the heart of a powerful kingdom that controlled key resources and trade routes. Its massive stone walls and towers remain a powerful symbol of African achievement, built without mortar yet standing for centuries as testimony to the skill and organization of its builders. The origins of Great Zimbabwe lay in earlier farming and herding communities that settled the Zimbabwe Plateau. These groups cultivated millet and sorghum, kept cattle, and worked iron, while also participating in regional trade networks that linked the interior to the Swahili coast. Over time, the advantages of the plateau's climate, fertile soils, and defensible terrain encouraged the growth of larger, more centralized settlements. By the 12th century, one of these had expanded into the urban complex we now call Great Zimbabwe. The city's layout reflected a hierarchical society. At its center stood the hill complex, a rocky acropolis fortified with stone enclosures. likely serving as the residence of the king and his closest retainers. Below lay the Great Enclosure, an immense elliptical wall over 200 meters in circumference and in places more than 10 meters high. Within this space were smaller walled areas and the iconic conical tower, whose purpose remains debated but may have served as a symbol of royal authority or as a granary for ceremonial use. Beyond these monumental structures stretched the valley ruins, a sprawling area of residential enclosures where the broader elite lived. The construction of these walls, using precisely cut granite blocks laid without mortar, required considerable labor, skill, and coordination. This architectural achievement reflected not only the technical expertise of the builders, but also the organizational capacity of the state. To marshal such resources for non-defensive monumental building suggests a society confident in its stability and desirous of projecting power and prestige. Great Zimbabwe's wealth came from its control over trade in gold, ivory, and cattle. The region's gold fields, particularly in the valleys to the southwest, were among the richest in Africa. Gold extracted here was transported along routes leading to Sofala on the Mozambique coast, where it entered the Indian Ocean trade network dominated by the Swahili city-states. From there, it reached markets in Arabia, India, and even China. Archaeological finds at Great Zimbabwe, including glass beads from India, Chinese porcelain, and Islamic coins, attest to the far-reaching connections of its economy. Cattle were another cornerstone of wealth and social status. They provided meat, milk, hides, and a means of exchange, as well as serving as dowry payments in marriage alliances that bound elite families together. The ability to maintain large herds indicated both prosperity and political influence, and the grazing lands surrounding Great Zimbabwe were carefully managed to support this resource. Politically, the kingdom was likely organized under a hereditary monarchy, with the king serving as both a secular ruler and a spiritual leader. His authority rested on control of trade routes, the distribution of valuable goods, and the mediation of religious and ancestral rites. The king's court would have been a center of decision-making, diplomacy, and ceremonial activity, reinforcing the legitimacy of the ruling dynasty. By the late 15th century, however, Great Zimbabwe's influence began to wane. Several factors contributed to its decline. Environmental pressures, including soil depletion and overgrazing, may have reduced agricultural and pastoral productivity. The shifting of trade routes, perhaps due to the rise of alternative gold-producing regions farther north, would have diminished the city's commercial centrality. As economic and political power moved, new centers emerged to claim the mantle of leadership in the interior. Foremost among these was the Kingdom of Mutapa, also known as the Monomotapa Empire. Founded by a leader who, according to oral tradition, was a prince from Great Zimbabwe, Mutapa established control over the northern portion of the Zimbabwe Plateau and extended its influence into parts of present-day Mozambique and Zambia. The new kingdom maintained the economic foundation of its predecessor, dominating the gold and ivory trade to the coast. But it also adapted to changing circumstances, particularly the arrival of new external powers. By the 16th century, Portuguese traders had established themselves along the Mozambican coast, drawn by the promise of direct access to the gold of the interior. The Portuguese sought to bypass the Swahili intermediaries who had long controlled this trade, negotiating, sometimes forcefully, with the rulers of Mutapa. They offered firearms, manufactured goods, and alliances, but their ambitions went beyond commerce. Portuguese records from this period reveal repeated attempts to influence or even control Mutapa's internal politics, often by supporting rival claimants to the throne. The relationship between Mutapa and the Portuguese was complex. At times, Mutapa rulers used the Portuguese presence to their advantage, playing them off against coastal traders or internal rivals. At other times, Portuguese intervention destabilized the kingdom, leading to periods of internal conflict and diminished authority. The Portuguese also sought to Christianize the region, sending missionaries into the royal court, though with limited long-term success. Despite these challenges, Mutapa remained a significant regional power for much of the 16th and 17th centuries. Its rulers continued to oversee the extraction and export of gold, ivory, and other goods, while maintaining a political system rooted in African traditions of kingship. The kingdom's decline in the later 17th century was the result of a combination of factors: intensified Portuguese interference, the emergence of competing states, and shifting economic patterns that reduced the profitability of its trade networks. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe and Mutapa is profound. These kingdoms demonstrate that complex, centralized African states could thrive far from the sea, building their prosperity on control of land, resources, and inland trade routes. Their monumental architecture, extensive trade connections, and political organization challenge outdated notions that Africa's wealth and sophistication were confined to its coastal or riverine regions. In the forest and savanna belt of West Africa, far from the desert caravans and inland river empires of the Sahel, two remarkable centers of political and cultural life emerged: the Yoruba kingdoms, especially the city of Ife, and the kingdom of Benin. These were not sprawling territorial empires like Mali or Songhai, but rather highly organized, urbanized states whose power rested on sophisticated systems of governance, artistic mastery, and, in the case of the Yoruba Oyo Empire, innovative military strategies. The Yoruba-speaking peoples trace their origins through a shared cultural and linguistic heritage, yet their political organization developed as a network of city-states, each with its own ruler, known as an Uni in Ife or an Alaafin in Oyo. Among these, Ife is often regarded as the spiritual and cultural heartland. By the 12th century of the Common Era, Ife had developed into a thriving urban center, home to skilled artisans, traders, and religious leaders. Archaeological discoveries in and around Ife have revealed an extraordinary tradition of naturalistic sculpture, crafted in terracotta, stone, and later brass. The artistry of Ife's craftsmen is among the most celebrated in African history. The life-sized brass and copper heads found there astonished early European discoverers for their realism and refinement, leading some to speculate, wrongly, that they could not have been of African origin. Today, it is understood that these works represent royal figures and deities, embodying both political authority and spiritual significance. The technical skill required to cast such sculptures using the lost wax method indicates a long tradition of metallurgical expertise and specialized labor, supported by a wealthy and stable society. Ife's influence extended beyond the arts. As a sacred center, it was regarded by many Yoruba polities as the source of kingship itself. Myths recount that Oduduwa, the ancestral founder of the Yoruba people, established his throne in Ife, and that subsequent rulers in other cities derived their legitimacy from this connection. This spiritual prestige allowed Ife to maintain a central role in Yoruba politics, even when it did not exercise direct military or administrative control over other city-states. Farther north, on the edge of the savannah, the Oyo kingdom rose to prominence in the 14th and 15th centuries, eventually becoming the dominant Yoruba state. Oyo's location allowed it to combine the agricultural abundance of the forest with access to the open grasslands, which were ideal for raising and deploying cavalry. This military advantage distinguished Oyo from most forest-based kingdoms, where dense vegetation limited the use of horses. By securing horses through trade with northern neighbors and training specialized cavalry units, Oyo was able to project power deep into surrounding territories, enforcing tribute and securing trade routes. The political structure of Oyo was both centralized and balanced. The Alaafin, king, held supreme authority, but his power was checked by the Oyo Mesi, a council of 7 principal chiefs who advised the ruler and could compel his abdication if he failed in his duties. This system of mutual accountability, reinforced by ritual and tradition, helped maintain stability over centuries of expansion and internal change. While Oyo and Ife shaped Yoruba history, farther to the southeast, another kingdom was forging its own path: Benin. Founded by the Edo-speaking people, the Kingdom of Benin developed in the 13th century under a dynasty of rulers known as Obas. Its capital, Benin City, was a marvel of urban planning, with wide, straight streets, large courtyards, and an intricate system of earthworks, walls and moats that encircled the city and extended for many kilometers into the surrounding countryside. These defenses were both practical and symbolic, demonstrating the Oba's authority and the kingdom's capacity to mobilize labor on a massive scale. Benin's political system centered on the Oba, whose rule combined secular and sacred authority. The king was supported by a hierarchy of chiefs and palace officials, many of whom were appointed from among the hereditary nobility. Decision-making was concentrated in the royal court, but the Oba relied on a network of loyal officials to manage distant territories, collect tribute, and maintain order. Like Ife, Benin became renowned for its artistry, especially in brass casting. The Benin bronzes, plaques, and sculptures depicting court life, battles, and religious rituals were created using the lost wax technique and adorned the palace walls. These works not only served as historical records, but also reinforced the Oba's divine status and the legitimacy of his dynasty. Many Benin bronzes were created to honor past rulers or commemorate significant events, preserving a visual archive of the kingdom's history. Trade was another pillar of Benin's strength. Positioned near the Niger Delta, the kingdom had access to both inland trade routes and the Atlantic coast. By the late 15th century, Benin had established contact with Portuguese merchants, exchanging goods such as pepper, ivory, and, increasingly, enslaved people for European textiles, firearms, and other manufactured items. The relationship between Benin and Portugal was initially one of mutual curiosity and benefit, with diplomatic envoys traveling between the two courts. However, as the Atlantic slave trade expanded in the 16th and 17th centuries, the dynamics shifted. While Benin engaged in the trade, it also maintained strict controls over its participation, at times restricting the export of enslaved people in favor of other goods. This selective engagement reflects the kingdom's ability to navigate the opportunities and dangers of early European contact, using foreign trade to strengthen its own position without ceding sovereignty. Oyo, too, would become involved in Atlantic commerce, particularly during its later expansion in the 17th and 18th centuries. Its cavalry allowed it to dominate neighboring states and capture people for sale to European traders on the coast, often through intermediaries. This trade brought wealth and firearms into Oyo, but also contributed to cycles of warfare and political instability in the wider region. Despite their differences, the Yoruba kingdoms and Benin shared certain characteristics. Both cultivated highly developed urban centers with complex political institutions. Both used art not only for aesthetic purposes, but as a means of political communication and historical record. Both balanced local traditions with engagement in long-distance trade networks, first with other African states, and later with European powers. By the 18th century, however, these kingdoms faced growing challenges. In Oyo, internal divisions, disputes over succession, and pressures from external enemies began to erode the centralized authority that had held the empire together. Benin, while still impressive, found itself increasingly drawn into the violent and destabilizing dynamics of the Atlantic slave trade. Yet the cultural legacies of these states endured. The artistry of Ife and Benin remains celebrated worldwide, with their sculptures recognized as masterpieces of human creativity. The political systems they developed, balancing monarchy, council governance, and ritual authority, demonstrate the diversity and sophistication of African statecraft before the colonial era. In the dense forests and river valleys of Central Africa, far from the Sahelian trade routes and the Indian Ocean ports, new political centers emerged in the late medieval and early modern periods. Among the most significant were the Kingdom of Kongo and the neighboring states of Ndongo and Matamba, situated in what is now Angola and the Western Democratic Republic of the Congo. These kingdoms rose to prominence just as a new and disruptive force entered African history: the sustained presence of European powers along the Atlantic coast. Over the next 3 centuries, their rulers would confront, negotiate with, and resist Portuguese expansion while navigating the growing demands of the Atlantic slave trade. The Kingdom of Kongo had its origins in the late 14th century, when small chiefdoms along the lower Congo River coalesced into a more centralized state. Its heartland, known as Mapembakasi, lay between the Congo and Kwango rivers, and from there, the kings of Congo, styled Manikongo, extended their authority over a vast territory divided into 6 major provinces and numerous subordinate polities. The capital, Mbanza, Congo, was strategically located on a plateau with fertile land for agriculture and access to riverine transport. By the early 15th century, Congo was already a regional power, but its encounter with the Portuguese in 1483 marked the beginning of a new era. When Portuguese explorers under Diogo Cao reached the mouth of the Congo River, they established diplomatic contact with the Manikongo. This relationship quickly deepened into an alliance, with Congo adopting elements of Portuguese culture, technology, and religion. In 1491, King Nzinga was baptized as Juan I, beginning a process of Christianization that would reach its height under his son, Afonso I. Afonso I, who reigned from 1506 to 1543, was one of the most remarkable rulers in African history. A devout Christian and a skilled statesman, he sought to integrate European learning, religious practice, and administrative techniques into Congo's governance. He corresponded regularly with the Portuguese crown, requesting teachers, craftsmen, and missionaries to help strengthen his kingdom. Under his patronage, Mbanza, Congo, renamed São Salvador, boasted stone churches, schools, and a literate elite versed in both Kikongo and Portuguese. Yet, Afonso's reign also revealed the dangers of close engagement with European powers. The Portuguese were eager to exploit Central Africa's resources, particularly in the form of enslaved labor for their colonies in the Americas. Although Afonso initially tried to regulate the trade and prevent the illegal seizure of his subjects, Portuguese merchants and their African collaborators often ignored royal edicts, raiding the countryside for captives. This not only strained Congo's political order, but also destabilized neighboring regions, as demand for slaves fueled conflict and migration. South of Congo, the Kingdom of Ndongo was emerging as a rival power. Its rulers, known as Ngolas, a title that gave modern Angola its name, controlled territory along the Kwanza River. Ndongo's economy rested on agriculture, tribute from subordinate chiefs, and trade in ivory, iron goods, and, increasingly, enslaved people. Portuguese expansion into Angola in the late 16th century brought Ndongo into direct conflict with European forces. Portuguese settlers, soldiers, and allied Imbangala warrior bands launched repeated campaigns to subdue the kingdom and control its trade. One of the most formidable figures to emerge from this period was Queen Nzinga Mbande. Born into the Ndongo royal family in the late 16th century, Nzinga first came to prominence as a diplomat. In 1622, she led negotiations with the Portuguese in Luanda, securing a treaty that recognized Ndongo's sovereignty and established terms for trade and military cooperation. Her skill in diplomacy was matched by her political acumen. When her brother, the king, died, Nzinga assumed the throne, taking the title of queen. Facing relentless Portuguese pressure, Nzinga adopted a flexible strategy. She forged alliances with neighboring African states, incorporated defectors and refugees into her realm, and, when necessary, relocated her base of power to avoid encirclement. After a period of resistance in Ndongo, she moved her court to Matamba, a neighboring kingdom she conquered and used as a base for further campaigns. Matamba's location along key trade routes allowed Nzinga to continue controlling the flow of goods and people in the interior, while also waging guerrilla warfare against Portuguese settlements. Nzinga's leadership combined military skill with calculated use of religion and diplomacy. She converted to Christianity, taking the baptismal name Ana de Sousa, but also maintained traditional African religious practices to appeal to diverse constituencies. Her correspondence with the Portuguese crown and her recruitment of runaway slaves and soldiers from Portuguese territories demonstrated her ability to exploit the weaknesses of her adversaries. Nzinga remained a central figure in the struggle against Portuguese domination until her death in 1663, by which time she had secured Matamba as a lasting power in Central Africa. The interaction between these Central African kingdoms and the Portuguese was shaped by the broader currents of the Atlantic world. The expansion of sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean created an insatiable demand for enslaved labor, drawing Kongo, Ndongo, and Matamba into a commercial system that linked African interior wars to European colonial economies. While African rulers sought to control and benefit from this trade, the scale of Portuguese military and naval power, combined with the disruptive influence of Mbangala mercenaries, gradually eroded their autonomy. Nevertheless, the kingdoms of Kongo, Ndongo, and Matamba were not passive victims of European expansion. They engaged with the Portuguese on their own terms when possible, adopting firearms, forging shifting alliances, and manipulating rivalries to their advantage. Christianity, introduced by missionaries, was adapted into local contexts, blending with African spiritual traditions to produce distinctive religious practices. Art, music, and court ceremony reflected this fusion of influences, creating a vibrant cultural life even amid the turbulence of the Atlantic slave trade. By the late 17th century, the political map of Central Africa had been transformed. Congo, once a unified kingdom under the Manikongo, had fractured into competing factions, many of which aligned themselves with either Portuguese or Dutch interests. Ndongo had been absorbed into the Portuguese colony of Angola, though resistance persisted in the interior. Matamba, under Nzinga's successors, maintained a degree of independence, continuing to trade with the Portuguese while guarding its autonomy. The histories of these Central African states during the Atlantic Age reveal both the opportunities and perils of engagement with early modern global trade. Access to new goods, technologies, and alliances could strengthen a kingdom in the short term, but the growing demands of the slave trade and the military reach of European empires created long-term pressures that were difficult to resist. The rulers of Kongo, Ndongo, and Matamba navigated these challenges with remarkable skill, leaving legacies of diplomacy, resistance, and cultural synthesis that endure in the historical memory of the region. From the forested valleys of Central Africa, our story now moves back to the highlands of the Horn, where the medieval Ethiopian kingdoms, first the Zagwe dynasty and then the restored Solomonic line, faced their own blend of religious ambition, external threat, and internal transformation. Here, kingship would be bound not to maritime trade or cavalry conquest, but to the defense of a Christian state in a diverse and shifting political landscape. In the rugged highlands of the Horn of Africa, a succession of Christian kingdoms developed a distinctive form of kingship rooted in ancient traditions, yet constantly adapting to changing political and religious landscapes. From the 12th to the 17th centuries, this realm experienced dynastic change, monumental religious architecture, devastating wars, and sweeping demographic shifts that reshaped its society. By the 12th century, the Aksumite Empire, once the dominant power of the region, had long since declined, its urban centers diminished, and its control over coastal trade largely lost. In its place, new Christian rulers emerged in the highlands, most notably the Zagwe dynasty. The origins of the Zagwe are somewhat obscure, but they appear to have been a highland people who consolidated authority over much of what is now northern and central Ethiopia. Their rise marked a shift of the political center away from the Aksumite heartland in the north to the Lasta region. The Zagwe kings are remembered above all for their remarkable program of church building. King Lalibela, who ruled in the late 12th or early 13th century, is credited with commissioning a complex of rock-hewn churches in the town that now bears his name. Carved directly from the volcanic tuff, these 11 monolithic and semi-monolithic structures were linked by tunnels and passageways, forming a sacred landscape designed to evoke the holy city of Jerusalem. In an era when pilgrimage to Jerusalem was often impossible due to political instability in the Middle East, Lalibela's churches offered Ethiopian Christians a symbolic alternative, reinforcing the kingdom's religious identity and the king's spiritual authority. The Zagwe dynasty ruled for roughly a century and a half, but their legitimacy was contested by those who claimed descent from the ancient Aksumite and Solomonic kings. In the late 13th century, a revolt led by Yekuno Amlak overthrew the Zagwe and established the so-called Solomonic dynasty, which asserted direct descent from the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This claim linked the monarchy to a sacred genealogy recorded in the Kebra Nagast, a text that became central to Ethiopian political theology. Under the restored Solomonic kings, Ethiopia expanded its territory and reasserted itself as a Christian power in the region. The monarchy combined religious and military authority, with the emperor, styled the Nagusa Nagast, or King of Kings, serving as both the protector of the faith and the commander of armies. Royal courts moved periodically, as was customary, but the church remained a permanent institution, with monasteries and bishops playing crucial roles in administration and cultural life. The Ethiopian highlands were not isolated. The kingdom maintained contacts with Christian states in the eastern Mediterranean, particularly through the Coptic Church in Egypt, which provided the Abun, or head bishop, for Ethiopia. Diplomatic missions also reached as far as Europe. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Ethiopian envoys visited the courts of European monarchs, sometimes in search of allies against Muslim polities in the Horn and along the Red Sea. Ethiopia's Muslim neighbors were powerful in their own right. To the east, in the lowland region known as the Afar Depression, and along the coast, Muslim sultanates such as Ifat and later Adal controlled key trade routes linking the interior to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Relations between Christian Ethiopia and these Muslim states varied from commerce and diplomacy to outright war, depending on the ambitions of their rulers and the shifting alliances of the region. One of the most significant conflicts erupted in the early 16th century when Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known in Ethiopian tradition as Ahmad Grang, or the left-handed, launched a jihad against the Christian kingdom. Leading the forces of the Adal Sultanate and allied Somali clans, Ahmad Grang overran much of the Ethiopian highlands between 1529 and 1543. His armies, armed with matchlock firearms supplied by the Ottoman Empire, inflicted a series of devastating defeats on Ethiopian forces, burning churches, destroying manuscripts, and threatening the very survival of the Solomonic monarchy. Ethiopia's salvation came in part through foreign aid. The Portuguese, seeking to counter Ottoman influence in the Red Sea, dispatched a contingent of musketeers under Cristóvão da Gama, the son of the famous navigator Vasco da Gama. Though small in number, these troops provided critical firepower, enabling the Ethiopian army to regain the initiative. In 1543, Ahmad Grang was killed in battle, and the Christian kingdom gradually reclaimed its lost territories. The war, however, left Ethiopia weakened, its resources drained, and its population scarred. Into this fragile landscape came another transformative force, the Oromo migrations. Originating in the southern lowlands, the Oromo people began a steady movement into the Ethiopian highlands in the 16th century. Driven by a combination of population pressures, political opportunity, and ecological factors. Organized into semi-autonomous clans and practicing a flexible form of governance known as the Gada system, the Oromo expanded into lands that had been depopulated or destabilized by the wars with Adal. The Oromo migrations were not a single coordinated invasion, but a prolonged process of settlement, alliance, and conflict. In some areas, Oromo groups integrated into local societies, adopting Christianity or Islam and serving as soldiers or administrators in regional polities. In others, they remained politically independent, establishing their own territories and influencing the balance of power within the Ethiopian realm. Over time, Oromo leaders would play increasingly prominent roles in the kingdom's politics, reshaping its demographic and cultural landscape. Despite these challenges, the Solomonic dynasty endured. In the 17th century, emperors such as Fasilides re-established stability and undertook ambitious building projects, including the founding of a new capital at Gondar. This city became a center of courtly life with stone castles, palaces, and churches that blended Ethiopian, Portuguese, and Ottoman architectural elements. Gondar's churches, adorned with elaborate wall paintings depicting biblical scenes, reflected the kingdom's deep Christian heritage and its openness to artistic influences from abroad. The 17th century also saw the consolidation of Ethiopia's relationship with the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church as a cornerstone of state ideology. Emperors patronized monastic communities, sponsored the copying of religious manuscripts, and defended the church's doctrines against both Muslim neighbors and Catholic missionaries. The Jesuits, who had arrived in the early 17th century seeking to bring Ethiopia into communion with the Roman Catholic Church, initially won some converts, including Emperor Susenyos. However, their efforts provoked widespread resistance, leading Susenyos to abdicate in favor of his son Fasilides, who expelled the Jesuits and reaffirmed the Orthodox faith as the official religion. By the close of the 17th century, Ethiopia remained a powerful, if regionally constrained, kingdom. Its rulers had navigated dynastic change, foreign invasion, and demographic transformation, preserving a distinctive political and religious identity rooted in both ancient tradition and adaptation to new realities. By the dawn of the 18th century, much of the Sahel was still shaped by the legacy of earlier empires such as Mali and Songhai. Yet the political map had fractured into smaller kingdoms and city-states, many of them Muslim in name but diverse in practice, blending Islamic traditions with older local customs. This religious pluralism, while long-standing, became a point of contention for a new wave of reformers who sought to renew and purify Islam in the region. Their campaigns, often called jihads, would bring sweeping political changes, toppling older dynasties, and creating a new order across large parts of West Africa. The most influential of these movements began in Hausaland, a region of walled cities and fertile farmlands in what is now northern Nigeria and southern Niger. Hausa states such as Gobir, Kano, Katsina, and Zaria were thriving commercial centers, tied into the trans-Saharan and regional trade networks. They were also highly competitive, waging wars for dominance and relying heavily on systems of tribute and slavery to sustain their economies. In this setting, Islamic learning flourished in urban centers, but religious practice often reflected a pragmatic blend of Muslim and indigenous beliefs. Usman Dan Fodio, a Fulani scholar and preacher, emerged as the central figure in the reformist movement. Born in the mid-18th century in the Hausa state of Gobir, he studied Islamic law, theology, and mysticism, and became known for his eloquence and deep piety. His teachings criticized the moral laxity and perceived corruption of Hausa rulers, especially their failure to implement Islamic law fully and their tolerance of un-Islamic customs. His call was not merely spiritual, it was also political, aimed at creating a state governed according to Sharia. Tensions between Usman Dan Fodio and the rulers of Gobir escalated over time. In the early 19th century, open conflict broke out when Gobir's leadership sought to restrict his preaching and suppress his followers. In response, Usman declared a jihad in 1804, rallying Fulani pastoralists, discontented townspeople, and allied Hausa groups. His forces achieved a series of decisive victories, capturing major cities and replacing their rulers with emirs loyal to the movement. The result was the Sokoto Caliphate, a vast confederation of emirates stretching from present-day northern Cameroon in the east to parts of Burkina Faso in the west. At its height, Sokoto was the largest state in West Africa. Usman Dan Fodio became its spiritual leader, delegating political authority to his brother Abdullahi in the west and his son Muhammad Bello in the east. This decentralized system allowed for local governance under the oversight of the caliphate, with each emir responsible for implementing Islamic law and maintaining order. The Sokoto Caliphate was not unique in this era of reform. To the west, in the Middle Niger Valley, Sekou Ahmadu launched a similar jihad that led to the creation of the Messina Empire in the early 19th century. Based in the inland delta of the Niger, Messina was a Fulani-led theocracy that prioritized Islamic education, judicial reform, and strict regulation of commerce and social life. Like Sokoto, it sought to integrate pastoralist and sedentary communities under a common religious and political framework. Farther west still, in the lands between the upper Senegal and Niger rivers, Alhaj Umar Tall, another reformist scholar, led a jihad in the 1840s that resulted in the establishment of the Tukulur Empire. Umar Tal's state combined military expansion with religious outreach, challenging both traditional rulers and French colonial encroachment. His campaigns brought him into conflict with the Messina Empire, which he eventually conquered, though at great cost in lives and resources. These jihads reshaped the political landscape of the Sahel. Older dynasties that traced their authority to pre-Islamic traditions were replaced or subordinated to leaders who claimed legitimacy through their religious credentials and adherence to Islamic law. The new states often sought to standardize taxation, judicial systems, and education according to Sharia principles, though in practice, implementation varied from one emirate or province to another. Economically, the new Sahelian orders depended heavily on agriculture, long-distance trade, and slavery. Captives taken in war were integrated into households, sold in regional markets, or sent north across the Sahara. While slavery had been part of West African societies for centuries, the scale of enslavement during and after the jihads increased substantially, partly due to the need to reward followers and maintain large armies. This reliance on slavery would later make these states vulnerable to moral critique from European powers, even as those same powers exploited slave labor in their own colonies. The jihads also had significant cultural and intellectual impacts. Centers of learning, such as Sokoto, Timbuktu, and Jenne, experienced a revival, with scholars producing works on law, theology, history, and poetry. Ousmane Dan Fodio himself was a prolific writer, authoring treatises that outlined the moral responsibilities of rulers and the duties of Muslims in public life. His daughter, Nana Asma'u, became one of the most influential women scholars in West African history, promoting women's education and compiling works in Arabic, Fulfulde, and Hausa. Relations between the new Islamic states and European powers were initially limited, but this would change rapidly in the later 19th century as French and British colonial expansion intensified. By the 1880s, both Sokoto and the Tukulur Empire faced growing pressure from European military expeditions and from African rivals armed with European weapons. The combination of internal divisions, overextension, and foreign encroachment would eventually bring an end to their independence. Yet even after their political structures were dismantled under colonial rule, the religious and cultural legacies of the jihads endured. The networks of Islamic scholarship established during this period continued to shape education and religious practice well into the 20th century. In many regions, the authority of local emirs or religious leaders persisted in modified form under colonial administrations, and in some cases, into the post-independence era. The jihads of the 18th and 19th centuries were not simply wars of conquest, they were movements of religious reform, social transformation, and state building. They demonstrated the enduring capacity of the Sahel to produce large, ideologically driven polities capable of mobilizing diverse populations under a shared vision. In the early decades of the 19th century, the southern African interior experienced a period of dramatic political and demographic upheaval that would later be remembered by two names, the Mefekan, meaning the crushing in Zulu, and the Difakani, meaning the scattering in Sesotho. This was not a single war or migration, but a chain of conflicts, forced displacements, and state-building efforts that reshaped the region from the eastern coastlands to the interior Highveld. Out of this turbulence emerged powerful new kingdoms and enduring leaders whose political and military innovations would leave a lasting mark on African history. The roots of the Mfecane lay in a combination of environmental pressures, competition for resources, and shifts in political organization. The late 18th century had brought episodes of drought that strained agricultural and pastoral systems in the Nguni-speaking communities of what is now KwaZulu-Natal. At the same time, growing participation in regional trade, especially in ivory, hides, and cattle, meant that control over key resources could bring significant economic advantage. This competition encouraged the consolidation of smaller chiefdoms into larger, more centralized polities capable of defending their herds and expanding their influence. Into this context stepped Shaka Kasenzanga Kona, who would become the most famous leader of the era. Born into the Zulu clan, a relatively minor group within the larger Mthethwa Confederation, Shaka rose through the ranks as a warrior under the patronage of Dingiswayo, the Mthethwa ruler. After his father's death, Shaka secured leadership of the Zulu with Dingiswayo's support, and upon Dingiswayo's death, he absorbed much of the Mthethwa into his growing kingdom. Shaka's military innovations transformed the way war was waged in the region. He replaced the traditional throwing spear with the shorter stabbing spear, or ikalwa, designed for close combat. He reorganized the army into age-based regiments, or amabuto, which lived together in military homesteads and trained intensively year-round. Discipline was strict and mobility was enhanced by requiring warriors to fight barefoot, toughening their feet and increasing speed. In battle, Shaka's forces employed the horns of the buffalo formation. The central chest engaged the enemy frontally, while the horns encircled them and the loins remained in reserve. These tactics allowed the Zulu kingdom to expand rapidly in the 1820s, absorbing or dispersing neighboring groups. Some communities were incorporated into the Zulu system, contributing manpower and resources. Others fled, triggering a cascade of migrations that spread conflict far beyond the Zulu heartland. Leaders who broke away from or were displaced by the Zulu established new states in distant regions, carrying with them elements of Nguni military organization. One such leader was Mzilikazi, who had served under Shaka before breaking away to form his own polity, the Ndebele, also called Matabele, kingdom. Moving first into the high veld of present-day Mpumalanga, Mzilikazi and his followers clashed with local Sotho-Tswana communities before eventually settling in what is now western Zimbabwe. From there, the Ndebele established a centralized kingdom that combined Nguni military practices with local political traditions, commanding both respect and fear among neighboring peoples. In the south-central highlands, the turmoil of the Difakane created opportunities for new forms of leadership. Mosho Shufrar, a chief of the Basotho, demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill in uniting scattered communities under his authority. From his stronghold at Thaba Bosiu, a mountain fortress in present-day Lesotho, Mosho Shu offered protection to refugees displaced by the conflicts, integrating them into his growing polity. He balanced military defense with strategic alliances, negotiating with both African neighbors and, later, European settlers to secure his people's survival. Other groups, such as the Gazanguni under Soshangane, moved northward into present-day Mozambique, establishing a powerful state that dominated trade and warfare in the lower Zambezi region. The Ngoni, descendants of groups that had fled the Zulu expansion, migrated even farther, eventually settling in present-day Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia. In each case, the migrants adapted to new environments, blending their own traditions with those of the peoples they encountered. The Mfakan, Difakan, was not solely the result of African political dynamics. Historians have noted that the expansion of European colonial settlement at the Cape and the disruption of local economies through trade in firearms and other goods created additional pressures on the frontier zones. The demand for ivory and cattle in coastal markets encouraged raiding, while the spread of firearms in some areas, but not others, altered the balance of power between communities. Although the direct influence of Europeans in the early stages of the Mfecane was limited compared to later decades, the broader economic and political changes of the southern African region formed part of the background to the upheavals. The human cost of the period was considerable. Warfare, famine, and displacement disrupted agricultural cycles and depopulated large areas, while other regions became densely settled by incoming refugees. Oral traditions from across southern Africa preserve memories of flight, hunger, and violence, but also of resilience, adaptation, and the founding of new communities. By the mid-19th century, the political map of southern Africa had been fundamentally redrawn. The Zulu kingdom under Shaka and his successors stood as a major power along the southeastern coast, engaging in both conflict and diplomacy with British colonial forces at the port of Port Natal, later Durban. The Ndebele under Mzilikazi, had established themselves in the Zimbabwean plateau, controlling key trade routes between the interior and the Portuguese ports of Mozambique. The Basotho Kingdom under Moshoeshoe I had emerged as a unified, mountain-based state capable of resisting both African and European encroachment. The military and political systems forged in this era would have lasting consequences. The regimental organization of the Zulu army, for example, remained in use well into the late 19th century, while the state-building strategies of leaders like Moshoeshoe provided a model for African diplomacy in the face of colonial expansion. The migration sparked by the Difakane also spread Nguni languages and cultural practices far beyond their original homelands, creating new identities and alliances in regions as far north as Central Africa. Yet the same forces that had allowed these kingdoms to rise would eventually draw them into direct confrontation with European imperial powers. By the 1870s and 1880s, British and Boer expansion from the south and Portuguese ambitions from the east would bring the southern African kingdoms into a new and dangerous political arena. From the upheavals of the Difakane, our journey now moves into the late 19th century, when the European scramble for Africa reached full force. In this final chapter, we will explore how African kingdoms, whether in the Sahel, the Forest Belt, the Horn, or the Southern Highlands, faced the pressures of colonization, mounted resistance, and, in some cases, adapted their monarchies to survive into the modern era. By the late 19th century, the political landscape of Africa was undergoing a transformation more rapid and far-reaching than anything seen before. For centuries, African kingdoms had risen, flourished, and declined in response to internal dynamics and regional rivalries. Now, however, the most pressing challenge came from beyond the continent. European imperial powers, spurred by industrial demands for raw materials and strategic control, embarked on a period of rapid colonization remembered as the Scramble for Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized the division of Africa among European states, often with little or no regard for existing political boundaries. Kingdoms that had once been major regional powers were abruptly confronted with foreign armies, new administrative systems, and an economic order designed to serve distant capitals in Europe. Some rulers chose to resist militarily, others sought to negotiate, and some adapted by working within the colonial framework to preserve a measure of authority. In the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, under Emperor Menelik II, achieved one of the most celebrated victories of the era. Drawing on a long tradition of centralized monarchy and diplomacy, Menelik expanded and modernized his army, acquiring firearms and artillery from European suppliers. When Italian forces attempted to impose a protectorate through the disputed Treaty of Wuchale, Menelik refused to accept the altered Italian version of the agreement. In 1896, Ethiopian forces decisively defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa. This victory secured Ethiopia's independence and made it a symbol of African resistance worldwide. In West Africa, the Asante Kingdom of present-day Ghana also resisted colonial encroachment. Throughout the 19th century, the Asante had fought a series of wars with the British, seeking to defend their sovereignty and control over trade routes. The final confrontation came in the early 20th century, during the War of the Golden Stool, when British officials attempted to seize the sacred Golden Stool, symbol of the Asante nation. Queen Mother Ya Asantewa led an armed uprising in 1900. Although the British eventually prevailed, the resistance cemented her place in African history as a leader who stood against imperial power. Farther east, in the Sudanic belt, the modest state in Sudan challenged Anglo-Egyptian control. Muhammad Ahmad, proclaiming himself the Mahdi, rallied Sudanese forces in the 1880s to expel Egyptian and British authority. His followers captured Khartoum in 1885, killing General Charles Gordon, and established a theocratic state. Although British forces reconquered Sudan by 1898, the modest revolt demonstrated the potential of religiously inspired resistance to mobilize large segments of the population. In West Africa's interior, Samurai Touré, leader of the Wassoulou Empire, resisted French expansion through both military campaigns and strategic retreats. Beginning in the 1880s, samurai built a disciplined army equipped with modern firearms and engaged in protracted warfare with French forces. He employed scorched earth tactics to deny resources to the enemy, moving his base repeatedly to continue the struggle. Despite eventual capture in 1898, his decade-long resistance stands as one of the most sustained anti-colonial campaigns of the period. Southern Africa saw its own fierce confrontations. The Zulu kingdom, which had expanded under Shaka in the early 19th century, faced British invasion in 1879. Under King Cetshwayo, the Zulu inflicted a stunning defeat on British forces at the Battle of Isandlwana, one of the few occasions when an African army decisively defeated a modern European force in open battle. However, British reinforcements eventually overwhelmed the kingdom, leading to its partition and the reduction of the monarchy's power. Not all African kingdoms resisted through armed conflict. Some sought accommodation, hoping to safeguard aspects of their sovereignty within the new colonial order. In the Buganda kingdom of present-day Uganda, the Kabaka, king, and his chiefs negotiated treaties with the British, retaining a degree of local authority under the protectorate system. While this arrangement curtailed Buganda's independence, it allowed the monarchy to endure and adapt, becoming a cultural institution that survives to this day. The colonial period fundamentally altered the nature of kingship across Africa. Many rulers were deposed, exiled, or reduced to ceremonial figures, their real power transferred to colonial administrators. Others became intermediaries, using their position to mediate between their people and the colonial state. The economic basis of royal authority also changed, as control over trade routes and local production was replaced by integration into colonial economies geared toward exports of cash crops and minerals. Despite these constraints, African monarchies remained potent symbols of identity and continuity. In many regions, kingship was bound to sacred traditions, genealogies, and cultural practices that could not be easily erased by foreign rule. Even where direct political power was lost, the monarchy continued to serve as a focal point for community cohesion and, in some cases, as a source of subtle resistance to colonial authority. The 20th century brought new opportunities and challenges. As African nations gained independence from the 1950s onward, some monarchies were abolished outright by republican governments seeking to centralize authority and break with the colonial past. In Ghana, for example, the Asante monarchy lost its formal political role, though the Asantehene retained great cultural influence. In other countries, such as Ethiopia, the monarchy remained central to national identity until political upheavals. In Ethiopia's case, the revolution of 1974 ended imperial rule. Elsewhere, monarchies adapted to fit within modern constitutional frameworks. In Morocco, the king retained significant political authority as both head of state and religious leader. In Lesotho and Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, kingship continues to play an active role in governance, though often contested in the context of democratic reforms. In many more cases, cultural or traditional kingships endure without formal state power, serving as custodians of heritage, language, and community values. The afterlives of African kingdoms are complex. Some, like the Zulu monarchy in South Africa, wield influence through cultural revival, public ceremonies, and engagement in national politics. Others focus on preserving historical sites, oral traditions, and artistic legacies that connect the present to the pre-colonial past. Across the continent, the survival of royal institutions, whether as political actors, cultural leaders, or symbolic figures, testifies to their deep roots in African social and historical life. The story of Africa's kingdoms, from their earliest formation in response to environmental change and migration, through their high points of wealth, power, and cultural flowering, to their encounters with global trade and colonial conquest, is a story of resilience, adaptation, and creativity. These polities were not static relics, but dynamic systems, constantly evolving to meet the challenges of their time. Even in the 21st century, the legacies of these kingdoms continue to shape African identities. Traditional rulers still bless marriages, mediate disputes, and preside over festivals. Their histories are taught in schools, celebrated in literature and music, and remembered in monuments both ancient and modern. The institutions they built, whether in the form of cities, legal systems, artistic traditions, or enduring political ideas, remain part of Africa's living heritage. This concludes the journey through the continent's royal past, a panorama of diverse political systems, creative cultures, and interwoven destinies that defy any single narrative. From the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe to the coral palaces of the Swahili coast, from the regiments of Shaka to the manuscripts of Timbuktu, Africa's kingdoms stand as evidence of the continent's long and complex history, a history that continues to inspire and inform its present.